Elbaph's worst case scenario is here. Its gods have been subverted, perverted, and all hope deserted with the rise of Nika the Destroyer, as well as not just one but two Loki, and every other apocalyptic creature Norse mythology has to offer, including this guy's mum, the most fearsome of all of the Norse creatures. And the beginning of this chapter definitely tells me that the fun is over on Elbaph, because the very first thing we have is a great big Jormungandr attacking the kids of the Walrus School, and Elbaph is now rapidly descending into chaos on two fronts. So look, I'm gonna have to take back what I said about the Holy Knights. I was pretty disappointed, with the idea of Shamrock leaving. Really liked him, and I just didn't see these guys as a threat that could live up to him, but I have to say, they're doing a pretty damn good job. And something that I love is what so few manga, I guess shonen villain groups do, is that they are working together. This is a cockishly well-organized plan to combine their abilities in the most catastrophic way possible, and I feel like it's going to take a lot more than I originally thought to beat them. Luckily, a few characters are stepping up in this chapter, like Saul. Watching Saul in action was amazing, and I can't help but be reminded of Garth. Just a really solid one hockey fist Saul sort of approach. And I think there's a good chance that Saul was inspired by, if not trained under or with Garth, because in chapter 0 we do see Saul with the gaggle of vice admirals responding to Roger meeting Shiki at Ed War, and I'd have to believe that Saul followed more closely in line with Garp's sense of justice. And this page is mostly dedicated to Garp allies with one exception, which is that you can see then Vice Admiral Sakazuki was also part of this force, so this page is almost like an Ohara incident reunion for the Marines, if reunions could take place 5 years before the event it is that they're acknowledging. And this was also confirmation that Saul is a hockey user, which makes sense because all Vice Admirals do need to be proficient in both armament and observation. But it's stuff like this that reminds you that Vice Admirals are no joke, or at least, they're not supposed to be. Vice Admirals have a pretty lackluster legacy in One Piece, whether it be any Slobby, the Paramount War, or Egghead Island. Every time they gather in their large Vice Admiral groups, they end up being a bit mostly useless, and not an amazing representation of the theoretical power that they are supposed to command. But with Soul's Punch, this is actually quite a clever pun in Japanese. The Kimatsu Shinken, which can mean both demon slaying punch as well as final exam. So it's very appropriate for punch fighting some demons in a school environment. And speaking of school environment, we also should not ignore Principal Kiba, because he has a very cool design, and I guess he's the guy that the Walrus School was named after, given his walrosity. I know Oda gets a little bit wacky with animal-inspired designs, but I have a hard time believing that Kiba is a full giant. He's got to be mixed in with some sort of fishman, and he may be a Wotan. Either way, I love the giant hammer, which is it's a very modern hammer with a claw at the back and everything. Very versatile. And he was a former member of the giant warrior pirates serving under Dory and Broggy. However, to the best of my knowledge, we've not actually seen Kiba before in either Dory and Broggy's flashback or Big Mom's flashback. But I think the reaction of the kids is very important in this scene, as they are awestruck by Saul and Kiba fighting to protect them. And this is probably showing them all for the first time what the ideal Elbaphian citizen used to be, even though Saul is not from here. But it's perhaps also showing them that this isn't something that should be so quickly abandoned. And from here, I continue to be quite impressed and slightly disturbed by Gunko's devil fruit abilities. It's such an extremely versatile fruit. I love it. And in this case, Gunko is using the vectorial arrows to force the sleeping children to move in the direction of the arrow. And this whole part very much reminded me of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a German legend of the Middle Ages. Allegedly, a piper was hired to deal with a rat infestation, so he played his pipe and took all the rats to a river. Job well done, except the mayor of the town refused to pay the piper for his services. So what the piper did, right? Epic prank. He used his abilities to do the exact same thing with all of the children in the town, played his pipe, led them all to a river, and drowned them. Or there's a more tame version where the piper uses the children as leverage to extort money from the village and then safely returns the children, but I'm more in favor of the first one. And one child who is notably missing from this chapter is Colin, who we haven't seen in quite a long while now. I believe the last time was in chapter 1135 when he was with Mama Ripley at the Walrus School, so I wonder what he's up to at the moment, and if he has somehow avoided the sleep powers of, I think, St. Killingham, which we'll talk about in a bit. If so, this is a prime opportunity, as all of the heavy hitters of the Straw Hats currently have a Loki issue, and every other giant on Elbaph are going to have their hands full with the colossal monsters summoned at the end of the chapter in that amazing 2-page spread. So who is left to save the children? Perhaps a Colin, but I want to go through what may have happened here. It would appear that St. Killingham, the Kirin guy, has an ability ability that can, at the very least, put people, or perhaps even children specifically, to sleep, and from that position, he can conjure their greatest fears into reality. That, or it's actually a combination of abilities. St. Killingham's putting the children to sleep, and perhaps St. Summers has the ability to manifest the creatures. And we know that these creatures are real because Saul and Kiba, they had to beat the crap out of Jormungandr at the very beginning of the chapter. So these are not illusions, which makes these final 2 pages quite mind-boggling to comprehend, because these creatures absolutely dwarf the actual giants we see in front of them who traditionally dwarf us. They make Saul, Kiba, and Ange look like normal humans. But the kind of tragic aspect of this is that all of this was part of an exercise where Ange got the kids to draw what they most fear, which I imagine she must be regretting right about now, having added a very dangerous spice to our imagination hot pot. Although I do love the small section where the kids going through and arguing about who or what is going to destroy the world. Mostly because, yeah, Loki is the first thing that comes up, but the first drawing we see is actually of Nika. One of these Elbaphian children, when asked to draw the thing it is that they most fear, chose the sun god Nika. And the kids are even arguing over who's scarier, Loki or Nika, which I find fascinating because everyone on Elbaph so far has been quite welcoming of Luffy, and a few have even been anxious to see his sun god form. But there's clearly a sector of giant society who genuinely fear Nika as the destroyer. And the conjuration of Nika is pretty damn cool. I love that this nightmare Nika has a beard because, mate, of course he does. The giants of Elbaph believe that any one of them could become the sun god, so of course he's gonna have a beard like all of the manly giant men. And this also made me realize that there's something a bit different about the Elbaph Nika to the warrior god that we first heard about from Who's Who, which all has to do with some subtle positioning like the sword. In Who's Who's silhouette of the sun god, Nika's pose is more like someone valiantly marching into battle, raising the sword proudly over his head to liberate all of the good people, and generally holding it in a more honorable and knightly fashion, whereas the Elbaph depiction of Nika holds his sword almost like a massive dagger about to strike and impale his unsuspecting victims. Plus, the smile that Elbaph Nika has is more on the uncomfortable side than joyous. So we have one Nika depiction very much presenting a noble savior, whereas the other definitely fits the more destroyer interpretation. So I don't know how Elbaph is gonna pan out, or even if we're gonna address this, but should the giant see Luffy transform, he may not necessarily be viewed as the savior that some believe him to be, and it could cause further tensions, especially if word gets out that he was the one to free Loki. So at that point, if I'm a giant who believes in Nika the Destroyer, or even a giant that's, on the Nika fence, then I'm thinking that Luffy is now doing everything he can to erase my existence. And so Luffy may even get blamed for creating these nightmarish creatures if the Holy Knights are able to stay out of sight. Just because this does seem like the kind of apocalyptic ending to the world that was depicted in the Elbaph mural. All of these dark, simplistic monsters rising to do battle for all of existence. But what's also very exciting is that it appears that a second Loki has hit Elbaph, so we're now in a situation where we have Loki, and Nightmare Loki does seem to be carrying Ragnir. However, he's also holding a sword, which looks like a slightly exaggerated child's drawing of King Harold's sword, the one we currently believe to be lodged into the head of Jarl. And this is because the guard is very similar, and I have yet to see any other sword on Elbaph possess this style of guard. And this makes sense because all of the kidlets have been taught that Loki murdered Harold and then whacked Jarl in the head. So of course the evil incarnation of Loki is going to be carrying the King's Blade as well. Although at first I thought this sword might be a reference to the giant sword skewering Elbaph, but they really don't look alike. And it's crazy that we still haven't found out anything about that, by the way. That would have been one of my first questions as a Straw Hat stepping onto this island. What is with that? But the other thing that really excites me about having two Lokis is that we may see a direct and literal contrast between how the giants of Elbaph view Loki through this nightmare form against the reality of who Loki actually is. That the real Loki might be a much nicer guy. Or if he's not, then the real Loki is significantly more horrible than even a child's imagination could conjure. Either way, I'm looking forward to it. But also making an appearance is Fenrir, which is a design that I love. But Fenrir is a creature we've been talking about a lot ever since Elbaph first began, even suspecting that Loki may have a Fenrir devil fruit. And before that, it was also suspected that Vigilante Garling may have a Fenrir fruit. He's a very popular creature. But with Loki, it's because Fenrir was said to be bound to a rock until the commencement of Ragnarok, like Loki being tied to the tree. Although I feel like seeing Fenrir here makes that less likely though, because the kids clearly believe these to be separate entities. We also have what I believe is pronounced as a dragon Draugr, which is this skelly dude here, which is sort of like old Norse zombies, but occasionally linked to the concept of more vampiric creatures as well. We also have a Nidhogg, a big wormy sort of thing that likes to nom nom the world tree. In addition to that, one of the kids most fears ghosts, which are definitely not high on my list compared to everything else we have here. And we also have physical manifestation of the concept of a storm, which very reasonably strongly resembles Zeus, and I wonder if this is setting up a potential battle between thunderclouds. However, we have yet to touch on my favorite nightmare creature so far, because there's a really funny moment in the flashback where all of the kids are arguing about what's more scary, and in among all of the standard suggestions, your Lokis, your Storms, your Nikas, one of the kids yells out, "My mum." And I really do not want you to miss this, because this kid's mother is actually in the very left-hand side of this 2-page spread, and to be fair to the kid, she looks horrifying. Although I have to say, when I first caught sight of this particular nightmare, I thought that it might be Big Mom. Not the real Big Mom, she still hasn't finished her lava bath, but the conjuration of a story that may be told about Charlotte Lin, one of the greatest enemies of Elbaph, and someone well worth being feared on the same level as Loki. And if these powers keep introducing new fears, then I think making a Nightmare Big Mom would be a very fun way to incorporate her Elbaph legacy into this arc. It doesn't have to be a major threat that we focus on, or even anything, more than just a page of seeing her. And maybe it could be her child self instead of her adult self, because the story would only be told about what she did as, what was she, 5 to 6 years old? But all in all, this is a pretty horrifying power that ties annoyingly nicely into one of the overall motifs of the final saga, which is imagination and belief. Currently, what we've been exploring are the positives of imagination through Luffy in Gear 5th, as well as Jewelry Bonnie being able to conjure any future that she genuinely believes could exist, not to mention Vegapunk's hypothesis on devil fruits being humanity's drive for imagination and evolution, although I guess I did mention it. But I like that what's happening here now is an application of the danger of imagination, because belief is not always a positive thing, and it can also be quite a self-fulfilling prophecy at times. If you properly believe that the worst is going to happen, then you're subconsciously going to work towards it. Not because you're actively seeking it out, but because you are not resisting it because you've already accepted it. And the strength of all of these nightmare creatures may be directly tied to how powerful each and every child believes them to be. So for example, in the case of Nika, if that one kid believed that he was unbeatable and going to destroy the world, then is that what becomes reality through this conjured Nika? Is this Nika unbeatable? Also, I'm not sure if we're quite there yet, but this chapter has potentially done a very standard One Piece thing of setting a clock, a countdown to disaster, as we now have an undefined time limit to keep track of, which is that when the kids reach the ship, they're abducted, and I guess we lose. There's probably going to be a lot more to it than that. In later arcs, it's very difficult to have a countdown to destruction that doesn't involve the fate of the entire literal island, but a clock is now present regardless. And that's before mentioning our other key threat here that has potentially set another big clock with all the fire. Last week, we went over a lot of fun subversive ideas about Loki, but after being mostly unshackled, he's played very much into straight expectations here, becoming a very threatening antagonist, and he does use Ragnir, which is now confirmed to have lightning summoning powers. And this may be the biggest lightning attack we've ever seen in the series, in fact, just one of the biggest attacks in general, because I know it doesn't look hugely impressive in the manga, but you need to remember the scale of Elbaph. This is the kind of attack that is completely covering and destroying almost any regular island in the One Piece world. The blast is that big, so Ragnir is practically an ancient weapon in its own right. And I now feel a bit more confident in thinking that the cut branch of an Atom Tree from the last chapter was most likely Loki inflicted, and I can definitely see why he is so incredibly feared by the giants now. Because Loki is actually capable of literally destroying all of Elbaph with significantly more ease than I was expecting. And remember that this is just a demonstration of Ragnir. Yes, there are ideas that it may be an object imbued with the legendary devil fruit power, but it's very possible that we haven't even seen Loki's true abilities yet, that there is no fruit in use. Although something that does make Hammer Fruit more likely is that Dr. Vegapunk did visit Elbaph, and a mischievous young Loki could have found his way into some sort of secret research that just so happened to be about imbuing fruits into objects, and he said to himself, "Loki, mate, you have the opportunity to do the greatest thing ever with this here hammer. And also a very important note about the hammer. It does appear that Loki is imbuing it with Haki, as it's making the trail effective Conqueror's Haki, which I think is to be expected with any endgame One Piece strong guy. We've just reached the point where it's difficult to create a character worth paying attention to that isn't a Conqueror's Haki user. But it also makes sense because of everyone we've met with Conqueror's Haki, Loki may be the one with the greatest sense of those kingly qualities. In fact, he goes well beyond that, because most conquerors have the ambition to become the pirate king, or in Doflamingo's case, he takes a step further as king of the world, but no one else so far has had the ambition to become an outright god and destroy the world. Although there is a chance that Rocksteady Zebek may have possessed a very similar kind of ambition, but that is a story for not now. However, Loki, I don't even really know what to believe here, but if I am to take his words seriously, and I guess I have no reason not to at the moment, he doesn't say that he wants to destroy Elbaph. He says, if you want to save it. So it seems more like he's using the island as leverage to get out of that final shackle, and that he can't really be his true self until he's completely free, which is also very sun god-esque. And he may even have aimed that lightning blast directly for a spot on the island with no village. But it is going to be interesting to see how Luffy grapples with this, though. In this chapter, we don't get a lot of Luffy, but there is definite shock and appall towards what Loki is doing. So it's a situation where Luffy's eyes and mind are telling him one thing, but his intuition is telling him another. And I don't really know how Luffy deals with this. He's not really one to negotiate, and I guess his logic was, look, if Loki starts being a dick, then I'ma thwack him in the dick. So this does feel like a very good potential setup for a Luffy versus Loki round 1? Question mark. And if so, I very much look forward to Loki's reaction to Luffy being immune to lightning, as well as discovering the Gear 5th form, and I do wonder if this could be Luffy's first real challenge since attaining Gear 5th, facing off against a man who is determined to inherit and steal Luffy's legacy as his own. So this could be a very personal fight, and one that unfortunately prevents Luffy from helping out elsewhere with the Plague of Holy Knights. The panel of Loki's lightning striking the Atom Tree is scarily similar to the lightning hitting the tree on the ancient mural. That is quite correct, and I suspect that this is very much on purpose. In the Elbaph mural, you can see a lightning bolt coming from what appears to be an Arc Maxim-like vessel that's also suspected to maybe represent Uranus, but it's pretty undeniable that this mural is starting to come to life. We have a Nika, we have a Loki, we have other assorted shadowy nightmare creatures, and more importantly, it all seems like it's coming to life because all the creatures were conjured by the imagination of children, just like how this mural was drawn by a child. So what Elbaph could be building towards is staging a trial run for the final war of One Piece, like a budget community theater production of a full-scale commercial musical to come. Since Loki says if you want Elbaph to be safe, remove the second shackle as well, this leads me to believe that he knows what's going on upstairs and strikes the Atom Tree to try and stop some of the monsters. Alright, so I am keen to find out what his actual wording will be in the official translation, but the way the current translation sounds does support that idea. Maybe not that he's deliberately striking someone upstairs, but that Loki isn't threatening to destroy Elbaph if he isn't released, but that he knows that Elbaph can't be saved unless he's released. And what also supports this is that Loki is one of the few people on the island who actually knows that the Holy Knights are present, although that would bring up the question of, well, why not just tell Luffy's group about them? Loki knows why they're here and to some degree what they plan on doing, although I don't even know if that logic works, because in this case, if Loki did do that, if he told everyone exactly what he saw in a painful amount of detail, then even Haradin probably wouldn't believe him. Because Loki and Liar, they're just synonymous concepts at the moment, and Loki might know that, which is why he's not even bothering and taking a more blunt approach. Calling it now, Usopp will basically repeat what he did on Thriller Bark and be the only one to be unaffected by this fear ability, and the Giants will mistake it as him being a man without fear. It would be pretty fun to have another hard Usopp counter. I don't think he'd be unaffected though. There's a big difference between fear and negativity, and that would seem a lot more like a Buggy kind of path to go down, where things work out in his favor to conjure a believable lie like, oh, Captain Buggy is such a magnificent man clown that he has no fear. Usopp is very different though. He's a character who needs a bit more substance, a bit more nuance, especially in this area, because being brave, that is his whole whole thing. That is his entire series arc. And you can't be brave without fear. So what might happen is, if Usopp was targeted, then what we see are that his fears are so great and numerous that it may overload the system. Usopp's imagination is so powerful that it turns every conceivable thing into a fear that engulfs the Holy Knights. And then everyone else, after seeing how much fear Usopp has and how after all of that he's willing to stand up regardless, then that to me would feel like a solid demonstration of true bravery, to literally see what Usopp's mentality is dealing with at all times. And it also opens up the potential of getting to explore the rest of the Straw Hats a bit as well. It'd be really cool to have them all fall under this ability and see what each individual member is afraid of. So maybe Nami conjures a massive Arlong, Frankie could conjure his battle Frankies and see his ships attacking innocent people, and then what Zoro sees is just a basic set of stairs, the ultimate counter to any swordsman. But the most interesting character to see by far would be Luffy. He doesn't have a whole lot of fear, and it might be something as simple as conjuring an empty fridge, or something even more Luffy-like would be for him to make friends with some of the nightmare creatures, to tame Fenrir, or even team up with Nightmare Loki. Because Luffy almost never interacts with anything as it's designed, he's quite unique like that. But I'm not sure if we'll get to see many, if any, adult fears though, because it would kind of break the theme that we're going for here with the childlike imagination and conjuration. And at the moment, I do quite like the idea of adults needing to face and quell the fears of children, much like any parent has to, just much more literally in this case. This also isn't anywhere near confirmed, but my assumption would be that whatever is conjured would disappear if the child was to wake up, which is why we're going to such extremes to keep them asleep. Something I didn't mention in the previous video is what happened with I believe it's the PE teacher, Mr. Wolf. He gave Soul a warning not to touch the children, which doubles as good advice for people in general. But attempting to physically snap them out of their trance does seem to have physical consequences. So the only way I can currently see out of this is to beat the Holy Knight, or Holy Knights plural, who are responsible, and do the typical devil fruit magic of knocking a user unconscious to deactivate their powers. Man on the internet, did you know that the girl named Ylva is named after Vicky the Viking's mum? She is definitely somebody to keep an eye on. I did not, but that makes a lot of sense, and this isn't her first feature either. She's had a fairly primary speaking role in previous chapters as well. But in this case, Ylva is the girl in the front of this panel, and she has a very Vicky the Viking inspired helmet, just as Colin does, and not all of the kids or even all of the adults have these, in fact most don't. So this is a very nice little nod to Oda's inspiration for the name of the character at the very least. And I don't know if this is going to be relevant at all, but the fear that Ylva drew was Fenrir the Wolf. Although something I'd be quite interested in would be seeing Colin's fear, because as a brave warrior boy, I imagine that he doesn't have the same fears that the other kids at the Walrus School have. I mean, I say other kids, Colin, he's 20 years old, but I think that all of these kids are about 20 years old, because they were making fun of Colin like he's their peer. And one of the things they yelled is that Colin doesn't even go to school. So I am pretty sure that all of these giant kids are older than a good chunk of people watching this video right now. Could Gunko secretly be Emu? She has similar arrow powers and said Nika was her worst fear. Alright, we've covered the arrow ability thing before, so put that to one side. However, the fear of Nika, that is very interesting. Because I do think it's quite natural for all world nobles to be afraid of Nika, even though Gunko, I don't think is one. Not just because Nika, the sun god, the warrior of liberation, threatens to dismantle their stranglehold on the planet, but because the idea of Nika the Destroyer does exist. And I love that in this chapter we have two characters state a fear towards Nika. One is an innocent child of Elbaph, and the other is a very not innocent member of the Holy Knights. I try to take the Vegapunk approach to this thought, which is to not assume who was right and who was wrong. So with that in mind, there is a world out there where the 20 kingdoms may have had a justified reason to be afraid of Nika during the Void Century. And that fear is what led to the formation of the world government. In our modern history of the One Piece world, the Nika legend is mostly passed down as the joyous warrior of liberation, but back 800 to 900 years ago, the prevalent legend could have been the Destroyer. And the world government may have seen their actions during the Void Century as quite just to protect the world, which includes wiping away all traces of the Great Kingdom and the ancient language out of the pure fear that it could be used to resurrect Nika. And when it comes to Gunko herself, I'm not sold on the secret Emu theory, or being a satellite of Emu, although I do prefer that idea. But in that last panel where she states that she fears Nika, I don't know how Oda does this, but I swear I can see that fear in her eyes. Gunko probably doesn't view herself as an antagonist. She doesn't seem to be an overly indulgent prick-style bad guy who does bad things and knows that they're bad, and that's why she does them, because she likes the bad. I don't get that from her. At the moment, the vibe I get is that Gunko believes she is doing what's best for the world. It's just a very twisted belief. I could end up being extremely wrong about that, but right now there's a distinct air of honesty around her that you don't often find with the residents of Marijois. And Gunko does seem like someone who believes in structure. She definitely has great concern for maintaining the hierarchy of the world, in which case even the idea of liberation would be terrifying, because freeing people from wherever they are in that hierarchy would create anarchy and chaos. But this does set up the surely inevitable moment where Gunko sees Luffy in Gear 5th, and I very much look forward to seeing how she deals with that, to see how terrified she becomes in the presence of Luffy and how Gunko handles that fear, the same way that the kids and the giants have to handle their fears. I guess it's either that or Gunko makes the NL face and it gets played for comedy. But speaking of NL, was NL not a god? Where's his haki? So this is referring to my comments about Loki having Conqueror's haki, obviously because of his belief that he is a god and his ambition to destroy the world. And to be fair, this is my bad. I should have expanded more on what I meant by that, because with just that alone, NL does also fit that description. But it's not just the belief, it's about the will and execution to fight for that belief. As NL was definitely more on the world noble spectrum of claiming to be a god. He 100% believed that he was a god, but he's not someone whose willpower ever had to be tested. And perhaps he does have Conqueror's haki deep down, but it's never bloomed due to not being properly tested. I'm personally not convinced by the explanation that Conqueror's haki is a genetic trait that you either do or don't have. I just think it takes an exceptional individual driven enough to tap into it. Because if you look at the list of known Conqueror's haki users, none of them were particularly gifted by life. Most of them suffered pretty tremendously and endured without their dreams or willpower being broken. Whereas if you're born as a world noble, yes, you do have the mentality of a conqueror and or god, but you're never put in a position where you have to exercise the willpower of that belief. It's the system around you that facilitates that delusion and nothing that you actually need to do for yourself. And that's a situation I think NL found himself in when he ate his devil fruit. He was gifted so much power that he never really had to fight for anything. The only real challenge he's had in his life was up against Luffy, and that it was a weird fight. There wasn't actually much fighting at all, so NL didn't really have an opportunity for evolution. But bringing this back around to Loki, he grew up in Warland, and so he possesses a very dangerous combination of belief that he is a god and having grown up being constantly tested in battle probably ever since he was able to walk, which also isn't too dissimilar from how Garp decided to raise Luffy. As soon as Luffy could walk, Garp threw him into a series of potentially deadly tests so that Luffy would endure and grow. And so it's no wonder that Luffy gets along so well with the giants of Elbaph, because Luffy's childhood was quite similar to growing up in Warland. Logia is my favorite type of fruit. What kind of Logia would you like to see in this arc or upcoming arcs? Love your stuff. What I would love to see is a wind Logia. We still haven't had that, although it's a very popular idea to claim that Dragon could have a wind Logia, which does very much fit the wind motif. Lots of videos on that on this channel. But the other one I love to see I think is a bit more morbid, and it's the idea of a blood Logia. Or if it's out there, just a simple water Logia. It's not supposed to be possible because that's a substance that directly counters devil fruits, sea god getting angry and everything. But surely someone out there was imaginative enough to make it work when these fruits were being cranked out. I'm calling it now. Ange is a spy or even one of the Holy Knights. I believe she had the kids draw those things as fuel for whichever Holy Knight's ability brought them to life. Oh, mate, not Ange, of all people. And look, it does seem like a really odd exercise. All right, children, today we're going to train our imaginations by drawing the scariest possible thing that you can think of, to the point where it's going to give Ylva nightmares, and I, Ange, do not care. And the fact that it happened just today as well, it is such insanely tight timing. So sharp that even Ange saying, I remember them at the end of the chapter is a bit weird. Because it's like, of course you remember. You just did it. This didn't happen yesterday or a week ago. And I've got to admit that it is very convenient timing. But I would also warn that we as readers have been trained to look for traitors in every arc now. Kanjuro on Wano and York on Egghead Island have scarred us to the point where a lot of readers now expect betrayal as a default element, and so are actively looking for the next traitor. And I myself am quite guilty of this in relation to my ideas about Jarl. As fun as he is, I never feel 100% comfortable around him. And if I was to bet some cold, hard, but numerically weak Australian dollars, then I would bet that there is a traitor on Elbaph, or that there was a traitor on Elbaph if it was King Harold. because we do still have the mystery of why the Abyss Circle was in the throne room, and also why it was suggested that Shamrock would visit Harold's grave. And even this chapter showing that Gunko and some of Elbaph have the same fear about Nika. So there could be a whole sector of giant society that has a lot more in common with the world nobles due to that fear of Nika. And Ange could be one of them. But I do have a lot of trouble seeing her as a traitor right now. Look, even with the extremely convenient timing of the fear exercise, it's a weird thing to do. So I guess she could have seen Shamrock and Gunko flying over and taken that as a signal. All right, kids, draw your fears quickly. But I'm gonna need a bit more before I start going in too hard on Ange though. What if a weakness to the nightmare creatures is facing your fears? Imagine the Elbaph kids seeing Luffy as Nika bouncing, acting goofy, and fighting to protect them, making the nightmare Nika go away. That does feel like a very One Piece solution, and it's also exactly what Nika is said to do, to spread joy and laughter and all of the good feeling things. Which works especially well with children because Luffy using Gear 5th is basically a living cartoon. There's no other demographic in this world that Luffy should be more effective with than children. So if Luffy can fight the nightmares and make them look like a joke, much like he did with Kaido, then that would show that there is nothing to be afraid of. And it might make the creatures disappear, or it might pacify them and turn them into very friendly creatures. It may also not be exclusive to creating nightmares. It's just that the kids were primed for that due to school that day. For example, if Jewelry Bonnie was to be caught in this ability in her current state of finally having attained freedom and not being afraid anymore, then her dreams could create a heroic Bartholomew Kuma to help protect all the kids. There's a lot of potential here, particularly if it's a more general dream ability rather than something specifically negative. And if it was a general dream ability, then we could have a really touching moment where it's actually up to the children of Elbaph to save the day. For them to use their imaginations like how Luffy uses his and how Bonnie used hers to create a legion of peaceful, wonderful creatures that help us fight back against the Holy Knights. But the challenge here is how you influence the mood of the kids while they're asleep. Until we can breach that barrier, which might be the result of St. Summers, we can't really have that conversation. It's a very hard-hitting move though. At first I thought that it was, quite standard world noble pettiness to target children, but it is so much larger than that. Because if you eradicate all of the children from a civilization, then you have just erased its future. Elbaph goes extinct. Mr. Internet Man, did we ever find out just what Smoker was transporting with that motorbike of his? Not yet, but I'm sure that it was something worth not appearing in the series at all for 9 years. That's how long it was between Smoker appearances. So this package better have been worth the 9 years of delivery time it took. Out of curiosity, do you have the statistics on percentage of viewers per country? I'm a Brazilian guy watching you from Canada, so I imagine you're pretty global at this point, and that's pretty cool. Keep up the great work. Mate, I have statistics on everything. YouTube really overloads you with information to the point where it becomes difficult to process. But the top 5 countries that watch this channel are overwhelmingly the United States in first place with over 40% of all viewers, followed by India, the UK, Germany, and Canada, all somewhere in the 5 to 6% mark. As for Brazil, surprisingly, that is this channel's 9th most viewed country. I don't know who from Brazil is watching me, apart from this guy, but last month, apparently there were over 50,000 unique viewers from Brazil, so I greatly appreciate that. And for anyone curious about completing the top 10, we have Australia, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Although in the spot of shame, I must say that the least viewed country on this channel is Croatia. So come on, Croatians, let's get our shit together. Have you noticed that there's a switch here? Normally arcs end in a celebration after liberating an island, but here the arc began with a celebration and what follows is destruction. That's true, we have kind of flipped things on Elbaph. Usually the big party does happen at the end, but also the big lore drops tend to happen at the end as well. It generally takes beating the main antagonist until the Straw Hat sees something like the mural on Elbaph, which is our lore reward for completing whatever mission we had on the island. And if this is the trajectory, then things are not looking good for Elbaph. Because if we keep going backwards, then Elbaph is set to end in the way that we find most islands in at the beginning, under a tyrannical and not at all fun rule. It'd be a bold way to end an arc, one of the only islands where the Straw Hats are welcomed and it results in complete destruction, which I guess very much in line with the prophecy of the Sun God. And actually, come to think of it, is exactly what happened with Egghead Island. Luffy the Sun God arrived and it was destroyed. So let's hope that Elbaph has a more merciful future again, but also Ragnarok does tend to be a bit of a world-ending event. 2 new devil fruits have just been revealed on Elbaph, one with the purpose of transforming your love into your demise, whilst the other seems almost deliberately engineered to combat Luffy's endless imagination. And we've also got a massive breakthrough with Loki, as well as lots of very subtle and I think underappreciated moments. This chapter was extremely solid if you know where to look, and right now I am looking at the Holy Knights, who are pretty perfect in this chapter. Seeing them around the dining table eating their gourmet meal was quite funny at first. That is until the horror of the situation set in, because this is a microcosm of the entire planet right now. You've got a small group of elites with access to anything they desire having a wonderful time, whilst everyone around them are dealing with a world that is impossibly stacked against them, fighting overwhelming nightmares that just seem to keep getting worse and worse. Eiichiro Oda is really good at making these subtle moments, the kind of stuff that maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal at the time. Oh, they're all eating, isn't that fun? But stuff that's a very solid building block for the bigger project. This is a big part of why One Piece works so well, because Oda never loses sight of the bigger picture, whereas some shonen authors do get a bit focused on micro week-to-week work, so much so that the larger macro story can end up feeling very undercooked. And there's also a small story to be told through the eating itself. Whenever food becomes a topic in One Piece, you should pay attention to it, because Oda often uses characters' relationship with food to tell us a story, which was most prominent on Wano because their main issue was starvation. But there's some interesting character work with Saint Summers and Gunko. When Saint Summers is eating, he has your classic arrogant, world noble expression, which I would describe as the face of entitlement. Like, yes, this food is good, and yes, I deserve it because of who I am. But when Gunko eats after the dream salt is conjured, her expression is extremely humble. Gunko's blushing, she's excited, and she feels privileged to be tasting this food, which is a very effective short story of status. It immediately tells you where Summers and Gunko stand in relation to one another, that Gunko is of a lower caste to Summers, and it endears readers a lot more to her and pushes us away from Summers, all by showing us facial expressions while they're eating. So it's small but brilliant visual storytelling. And it might be a bit early for this discussion, but I can't help but wonder if we're setting Gunko up for redemption, because let's be realistic here, we haven't seen her full face yet, but she is almost certainly your stereotypically beautiful One Piece Oda woman design, and in every arc from Dressrosa onwards, women with those designs tend to flip sides, and here is how Eiichiro Oda is setting us up for that. Gunko seems to be following a very standard, tried and tested Oda path. Characters initially presented to us as antagonistic all of a sudden have this pretty dark past, like they need to be liberated from their antagonism, usually wrapped in a very feminine and aesthetically appealing package. Think characters like Viola, Charlotte Pudding, Hiyori, Stussy. They are all examples of the villain to protagonist pipeline set up specifically to fit these aesthetic brands of women. And I am getting the feeling that Oda is keeping Gunko distinctly separate from the classic world noble traits. She doesn't even have the saint title, so she's not really one of them to begin with, and while she does believe in their superiority, she doesn't display many of these superior qualities herself. And Gunko is also the only Holy Knight who seems at all concerned by the presence of Luffy, whereas the others, especially Saint Summers, don't seem to believe that failure on Elbaph is even possible, which I imagine would also be the Shamrock thought process as well. Don't know about Saint killing him, he seems a bit more meek and might have some concerns, but right now that's also what's separating Gunko in addition to all of the everything else I said. And her fear makes a lot of sense. Gunko has probably seen Luffy's bounty and noted his visual similarities to Nika, the thing that she is afraid of most in this world, so Gunko is probably taking Luffy a lot more seriously than almost any antagonist to have come before her. So something's gonna happen here, and it doesn't need to be Gunko switching sides. It might be something a bit more interesting and nuanced to do with a commentary on status, or I guess lack thereof. However, fictional pirate history does tell us that a pretty woman becomes a protagonist in every arc since Dressrosa. So that's currently what I'm betting on. Meanwhile, the opposite effect is happening with Saint Summers. I think that Oda's now doing quite a good job positioning him as a despicable antagonist, and I guess if Shamrock is gone, then that role does fall to him. Because Gunko is submissive by nature, she doesn't have the status to carry this group, and Saint killing him feels a bit more dopey and obedient as well. So if Loki doesn't turn out to be the main antagonist of Elbaph, then it could end up being Saint Summers now. Although I still really want Shamrock back, because what Oda's done here, right, is you've gotten a match on fictional pirate Tinder and it's Shamrock. Wow, looks good. So you arrange the date, but the guy who actually shows up for the date is Saint Summers. And so you feel just a little bit deceived. But Summers' devil fruit is named in this chapter, and it is the Iba Iba no Mi, which is taken from the word Ibara, which is a broad term to refer to green scenery with thorns, and you see this word everywhere in anime. For example, if you're a My Hero Academia fan, then you'll probably immediately recognize a girl named Ibarra whose quirk allows her to grow super spiky vine things. Although the first thing that I thought of was Joseph Joestar, specifically part 3 because he's an old man with a thorny stand. The devil fruit itself might seem a bit underwhelming in comparison to Gunko killing him and even Shamrock's sword, but I really like it for 2 reasons. One, because it's nice to see an arguably mundane devil fruit power again. I know that as fans we often like to say that the strength of a devil fruit is only as powerful as the creativity of the user, but the end of Wano and beyond has made that a lot more difficult to argue, especially since the main character, who was the primary example of using that mundane power well, has now been upgraded to a literal god power. But this fruit, at least at the moment, seems to be all about how Summers applies it. And the second reason why I love that is because it is extremely thematically perfect. At the end of chapter 1142, we started to get the sense that Summers is going to have a character theme of twisted love. When he said that, to know love is to wound one another. And in retrospect, he was also summoned with Love Heart underwear on, which turns out isn't just for pure comedy, no. It's actually extremely surprisingly relevant to his character. And all of that gets amped up to quite the extreme in this chapter, where Summers does display that classic world noble cruelty that I've been expecting. Because you gotta remember, these guys, they're not like most antagonists. Accomplishing their mission isn't how they derive satisfaction from existence. It's all about how they can complete their task whilst inflicting as much mental and physical distress as possible. And Summers' chosen method is to exploit the concept of love. Something that I'm not entirely sure that world nobles feel. The only example I can think of off the top of my head is St. Charles' father being concerned and distraught when Charles got hit by Sai and Leo, but otherwise they don't really seem to express anything that even comes close to love. So the very idea of love might be a fascination to them, like observing equality in a different species, or at least it's a fascination for one of them. Because what Summers is trying to do is strike that perfect balance between love and suffering, and in this case through the parent-child relationship. Summers is creating a situation where parents become desperate enough to want to save their children that they try to touch them regardless of the pain that the thorns will inflict, which will eventually kill the parents who won't give up due to that profound love they hold for their children. And then afterwards, they're going to wake up the kids just in time to watch their parents die, thus exploiting and distressing the other side of that love. I have to say, it's pretty impressively sickening, especially the idea that they're deliberately slow marching the children through a road of maximum visibility and maximum danger to ensure that as many people are able to see them and have more than enough time to give their lives to try and stop them. Because I mean, what are the options here? You either sacrifice yourself trying to save the kids, or you give in to despair and you make a decision to let the kids die. Or if not death, then walk off to a fate even worse than death. And it's times like this that do make me question Oda's philosophy as an optimist. If you read One Piece, I think it's pretty hard to come away with a message other than hope. But POV, right? You are Eiichiro Oda. And in order to continue building that optimism, you have to come up with increasingly disturbing and convoluted ways to showcase pain and suffering. Oda probably spends quite a bit of time thinking of the most physically and mentally appalling situations that he can place his characters in. And then what he does is he plucks that thought from his imagination and inserts it into fictional reality, much like the ability of a certain Saint Killiam. His fruit is named as well. It's the Ryuryu no Mi Motokirin, which is the 7th devil fruit in the Ryuryu family, which usually consists of dinosaurs. So this is actually the first mythical Ryuryu, remembering that Kaido's devil fruit was a fish. And I'm not familiar enough with Kirins to know this, but I didn't think that dream manipulation or dream conjuration was one of their abilities. And then again, Kirins can do pretty much almost anything, so why not? But I do know that this Kirin, this Killiam, has dream manifestation powers. The way it appears to work is that you need to be thinking of something, then be put to Kirin sleep, and Killiam can take that thought it is that you were thinking of from your dream and bring it into reality, as we see with the very fancy Salt in this chapter, which is a disgustingly powerful ability, as we've all experienced because our main protagonist has a very similar power to bring his dreams into reality now. Although in the case of the Salt, it is noted that tasty as it may be, any food taken from a dream doesn't grant any nutritional benefits, which is thematically appropriate because St. Killiam doesn't exactly exist to make dreams come true. In fact, he's part of an organization designed specifically to suppress them, so anything he can do will have that aspect of hollowness to it. In comparison to Luffy's dream/imagination abilities, which do have substance to them, because he is someone who exists to make dreams come true. Although in terms of substance, Killiam's fruit does remind me a fair bit of Streisand's Kuku Kuku, where he can turn anything he wants to into food that does provide nourishment, but does not taste good, not good at all, which is very much the opposite of Killiam. Killiam's fruit makes food taste phenomenal, so it satisfies the very superficial needs of the world nobles, the only needs that they're particularly concerned with at all times, but it's ultimately, again, quite hollow. Still extremely useful though, and I'm both excited and terrified to see what St. Killiam can do going forward, because at the moment I don't see any reason why he can't use this ability on anyone, including Straw Hats, some of which have quite vivid nightmares. For example, let's say that Sanji is unfortunate enough to encounter Killiam. That would be real bad, because that boy has some deeply disturbing dark imagery in his past that could be manifested against him. And I'm not even talking about his time as a child of the German Kingdom. What I'm talking about are Hell's memories. If Sanji were to be subject to this ability, then what I imagine happening would be the manifestation of an army of Okama to chase him down. One, because it's funnier, and two, because I think we're pretty done with Sanji's childhood trauma. I feel like defeating Queen, who had all of the abilities of the German Kingdom and who was a direct colleague of Judge, was Sanji symbolically dealing with all of that so that he can move on. Move on to his next greatest trauma, that is, which was of course him spending 2 whole years in the Kamabaka Kingdom. Sanji could even manifest Emporio Ivankov directly, which I think would be really fun, because Luffy would recognize Ivankov, and that is one of the reunions that I am still so keen to see all these years later, because Luffy still hasn't seen Ivankov since the Paramount War. But as for what Luffy's doing right now, meanwhile, in the underworld, we have some potentially maybe kinda good news, as Luffy has managed to one-punch man his way out of the immediate threat of Loki. And it's probably one of the weakest looking punches we've ever seen Luffy throw. The way I read it is that Luffy was performing a bluff attack, because we do see him gigantify his arm, although I don't think he gigantifies his bones. But we do see it get bigger as per normal with the attack, but the actual impact just shows Luffy with his regular noodle arm, which makes it look like he just gave Loki a light tap on the head. And what I'm thinking is similar to Usopp inflating the 10-ton hammer to make Perona believe that she was about to die, even though he wasn't going to physically harm her at all. So we make Loki believe that he's about to be hit with something real hard, and then we hold back because Luffy doesn't want to actually hurt him. Luffy wants to heal him. But Loki succumbs because he thinks that he's going to be hit with something much, much harder. But with Loki pacified for now, we are treated to a small Loki Harridan flashback, another brief and slightly more clear flash into the past, which we will likely inevitably get an extended series of chapters exploring, which could even be incoming next week. The way this chapter left off definitely lends itself into leaning into a full-on flashback, but something that I immediately noticed about Child Loki is the weapon he was wielding, because this is all pre-Ragnar, and Loki is instead carrying a very classic Kanabo, which is of course the trademark weapon of Mr. Sir Kaido, as well as spawn of Kaido Yamato. And I do have a video on this channel already exploring the idea that King Harold may have been the father of Kaido or related to Kaido in some way, because they do have strikingly identical facial features. And while this chapter confirms nothing, it is fascinating to see that Loki seems to have gone down the path of the Oni as well with his spiky club, which I have to imagine was a point of contention for King Harold, someone who removed his own horns in an effort to expel that ancient giant visage. Although something that I completely missed the first time I read this chapter is the fact that Harold still has his horns in the flashback. So this is before he felt strongly enough to remove them, meaning that it may even have been Loki who drove him to do it, because one of Harold's sons wholeheartedly embodies everything that he hated. Horns, Kanabo, the penchant for violence, everything. And I should emphasize that Loki wielding the Kanabo is more than likely visual language to signify how different he is compared to Harridan. You've got one giant child who is everything Harold was looking for visually and spiritually, but who was born from allegedly tainted blood, bad Harridan, bad. Whereas then you have the assumedly pure-blooded Loki, who represents everything that Harold was desperately trying to pivot away from. And this chapter also emphasizes that by showing us Loki without his helmet for the first time, which is a pretty big deal. Prior to this, this, we didn't even know if Loki actually had horns or if they were ornamental, like an image he was trying to construct. And there was even one pretty dark theory that Loki was wearing the horns that King Harold ripped off in some sort of rebellious act against his former father. But I really like seeing Loki without his helmet, because this could just be artistic wankery that I'm about to say. But seeing him without the helmet for the first time was quite exposing. Like, we are finally allowed to see the real Loki, which is also matched by his dialogue at the end of the chapter confronting Haradin about the truth behind their father's death, or at least the truth behind why Loki caused their father's death. And there is definitely a tragic story incoming, because as much as he's drawn as very scary, silhouette-y in the flashback, Harold did seem to both love and care for his children. And what happened with his family might tie into what St. Summers is doing right now, because we are really hammering in that theme that to love someone is to wound one another. So perhaps Loki killing Harold was his expression of love, and that there was a situation where this was the only true expression of love available. And also something that I'm not sure if we'll get to explore, but a curiosity that I have would be Luffy's thoughts on this brotherly dynamic between Haradin and Loki. I don't know if this is maybe a bit too deep for Luffy, but he does have this ability to pierce through all of the personal drama and really focus on the big basic picture. That big basic picture here being that Loki is Haradin's brother. And Luffy might encourage Haradin and even side with Loki because of his feelings towards his own brother Ace. But it's the idea that Luffy would want to heal this brotherly rift because Luffy knows how hard it is to lose a brother. And it's not like Luffy is incapable of this, it's just unusual. Although there are a couple of moments in One Piece where Luffy becomes weirdly invested in the personal relationships of others. The example I usually come back to is Rebecca and Kyros on Dressrosa, because back then Luffy dropped everything to make sure that those two were able to reconnect and live the lives that they wanted to live together. And he could do the same here, because it looks like we are leading to that reunion, because in the flashback it was apparently King Harold's desire to see Haradin and Loki lead and support Elbaph together, which is still going to be a very tricky thing to pull off, because Loki does appear to have been quite a bit of a dick to little child Haradin. But then again, Ace was quite a prick to Luffy, at one point even suggesting that they kill him, so that wasn't the most healthy fraternal relationship growing up either. Although everything turned out mostly alright, I guess except for the death. We'll try and avoid that this time though, and if Haradin is willing, then we could be about to find out the tragic and sinister truth of Elbaph extremely soon. I fully expect Gunko to try and direct Zoro with the arrows just for him to turn around and go in a completely different direction. This may be the best comment I've ever read on this channel. In a weird world where there's a natural counter to each and every single ability, like Luffy's rubber to Enel's lightning or Usopp's self-doubt to Perona's negativity, I can absolutely see Zoro being Gunko's natural counter and giving us that much-awaited third Enel face in the series. And what might end up happening here is actually a bit of a course correction. Gunko tries to make Zoro go the wrong way with the arrows, but Zoro's poor sense of direction defies this and makes him go the right way for the first time in his life. The way Loki said, "Looks like I'm gonna lose this round," I read as Loki having future sight. Okay, yeah, there have been a couple of potential Loki future sight hints, although I don't know if you need future sight to see how this conflict was gonna end. I think Loki knew as soon as Luffy called out his attack that it was over, because it didn't matter what that attack was. Loki's bluff was called, as Loki was using everything he had just to stay standing, so even a gentle breeze would have toppled him. Calling it now, Usopp's dream to become a great warrior will temporarily become a reality thanks to the Dream Fruit, and he will defeat the God Knight. So this chapter was extremely important because it established that killing him doesn't just have a nightmare power, it is a dream ability in general. And aside from Luffy, there is no one on this planet with a more active imagination than Usopp. In fact, I think that Usopp's imagination could even surpass Luffy. He just doesn't have the will or magical fruit mechanism to bring a lot of it to life. So here's a cool idea. What if Elbaph ends up being saved by Usopp's lies? It doesn't matter if they don't exist, so long as Usopp can conjure a strong enough mental image, which I believe that he can, of anything. Because given that Usopp spends most of his time living in his imagination, I think that what comes out of there could be more powerful than pulling dreams from anyone else. I mean, just think about the salt. Killing him was very impressed because Summers was thinking of a very specific kind of salt. It took a very precise mental intent meant to conjure. And if Usopp was to get a hold of this ability in a situation best described as somehow, then he could bring every lie he's ever told into reality. Perhaps even including a dream version of himself to save everyone, an actual god Usopp. Because again, look, I'm happy to box Usopp or face him in any kind of physical close combat, but in a battle of imagination, this man is Kaido. I really do not think that Usopp can be beaten in that realm. Of course, a lot of this could be very classic One Piece cope. There was a lot of this sort of talk happening on Egghead Island with Frankie. Each and every week we were coming up with more new ideas for Frankie to eventually have his big moment. And I guess that's a thing to keep in mind about Killingham's Devil Fruit, as insane as it is. It has effectively infinite potential. So much so that Eiichiro Oda could spend the remainder of One Piece just exploring this fruit alone and still never come anywhere near close to comprehensively exploring everything it can do. But there's a couple of other very important things about Killingham's fruit that this chapter tells us. One is the pretty bleak idea that these dreams won't disappear if the dreamer wakes up, because the salt didn't vanish after Saint Summers woke up. Meaning that even if we do manage to free the kids and wake them up, these nightmare creatures are still going to be there and they're going to need to be dealt with in another way. I guess the cop-out answer would be to knock out Killingham and get rid of the powers that way. I don't know if that works though, because Killingham did fall asleep in the previous chapter and the nightmare creatures were still there. Then again, there is a difference in shonen between sleeping and knocked out. Either way, I hope that's not the way it goes. But the mechanics of the fruit also show us that the dreamer needs to be thinking of the conjured object right before being put to sleep, which may add a bit more substance to the Ange is a traitor theory, very conveniently having all of the kids draw their greatest fears right at the time that the Holy Knights needed those fears the most. And to get slightly more conspiratorial, because it's very fun, the stronger the love one has, the more that St. Summers' thorns will harm you, which is why Saul and the PE teacher, Mr. Wolf, got hurt. But then you have Ange over here in this panel very clearly handling one of the kids and not being harmed in any way whatsoever. It might just be because the thorns only take effect when the children are put face up in march mode, or it could be because she's a disgusting, soulless, heartless traitor. At the very least, it is gross negligence of a teacher, and an internal investigation should be conducted into the classroom practices of Ange. And this is an interaction that I don't think will ever happen, or if it does, maybe not on Elbaph, but a pretty hard counter to St. Killingham would probably be Blackbeard, because look, rumor has it, it's going around the One Piece world, that this man does not sleep and does not dream. And you know what? Let's forget that second part for a bit, which would mean that Killingham can't pull anything out because there's no dreams. No, we have a more basic problem than that, because Killingham couldn't even use the initial ability of sending Blackbeard to sleep to begin with, which is a very underrated part of this fruit, by the way. A devil fruit that just puts people to sleep would be pretty damn strong on its own, just not against a certain someone. Didn't Uta also have the same dream fruit? Not really, but kind of, but also not really. In Film Red, Uta had the creatively named Uta Utanomi, or the Sing Sing fruit, which transports people's consciousness into the Uta world, which is kind of a dream world, but also not, because the people caught in it aren't actually asleep. Their consciousness is just elsewhere. It's been separated from their bodies. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite, because Uta had to force herself to stay awake to maintain the Uta world. But she could control pretty much anything in that world as if it was a dream. If Killingham is able to bring seasonings from dreams into reality, then any food made with those can taste amazing and have nutritional value, even the ones from the Cook fruit. That is exactly right. All you need to do is combine both of these fruits and you have the ultimate chef. With Stroisen's Devil Fruit, you can turn any object you want into horrible tasting food. And then you can use Killingham's fruit to conjure some sort of fantastical seasoning to cover up the fact that you're actually eating a log. Did you notice that Flashback Loki was still blindfolded? He certainly was, and that is a big deal for reasons. The two leading ideas thus far for needing to cover Loki's eyes were firstly that it had something to do with the legendary devil fruit that he ate, and that part of his imprisonment was to restrain that ability, whilst the second was that the blindfold was there to prevent Loki from using some sort of highly advanced observation haki. And it's looking like neither of those are correct. Although we do need to remember a thing about the giants. In this flashback, it looks like Loki and Haruden are children, but looks cannot be relied upon to tell us how old a giant is. Meaning that yes, Loki could have this child-looking body, but he could be older than Luffy in this flashback. And so he would have definitely had the years on this planet to develop some sort of amazing observation haki, especially since he was constantly immersed in the infinite battle that is Warland. The age is kind of tripping me out though, because in this flashback, Haruden looks exactly the same as he did in the Big Mom flashback, which took place when he was 18 years old. Which means that Haruden is 18 years older than Loki, because we first heard that Loki was born in that very flashback. So in the flashback in this chapter, Haradin has to be in at least his 20s while this is happening because Loki can't be 0, and Haradin might even be approaching his 30s here. Back to the bandages though, they could be there purely for aesthetic reasons, like something designed to cover up an undesirable trait of the ancient giants. They may have had a certain evil eye that King Harold would not allow to be seen. King Harold may have been disgusted by them, like how Big Mom always hated looking at Pudding's third eye. And I have seen the suggestion that Loki may have been born blind and that could be it, but he can definitely see because he managed to recognize Shamrock's face as being the same as Shanks's face. And the only other amazing observation Haki user we know of who is blind could definitely not see faces, because Fujitora was regretting blinding himself because he wanted to see Luffy's face. So at the moment, I think that being born with some sort of ancient giant eyes is more likely than being born blind. I should say that we have actually seen Loki's eyes before, kind of. When you go back to our first image of Loki, the silhouette proposing to Lola, this man definitely has eyes on full display. But he also has no horns and looks nothing like Loki actually does, which reinforces what Oda said about not originally planning to make an Elbaph arc. Compare Killingham and Foxy's abilities. No. So you're telling me there is a love-coded villain who is torturing children? Sounds like, at minimum, a Sanji fight, if not a Nami-Sanji combo. Yeah, it definitely hits both of their respective triggers. Nami gets very, very invested in causing people pain if they are harming children. Although right now it's difficult to predict how this pans out, because as things stand, Summers is now kind of the main antagonist of Elbaph, unless Shamrock returns or Loki gets healed and tries to enact some sort of Ragnarok. The issue with that is that One Piece is usually a very simple series. The strongest bad guy on the island is the one that Luffy fights because he's the main protagonist. But I do have a lot of trouble seeing a satisfying Luffy versus Saint Summers showdown, because Summers doesn't really feel like a step up from the Five Elder Stars, or Kaido, or Doflamingo, and it still feels like Luffy versus Loki is on the cards. That just seems to be much more right to me at the moment, and I'll need to check with the official translation, but Loki's line in this chapter about Luffy winning this round does also emphasize that a bit, that Loki is eventually planning a round 2 against Luffy, because they have a lot of business to settle with Loki claiming to be the sun god and everything and having a bad history with Shanks. And yet, sure, the main antagonist of this arc, it may not be Loki, but I still don't think that Summers is our pinnacle here. But here's what I'm hoping doesn't happen, and I think at the moment there's a scary potential that it might. With Killingham's powers, there is a strong temptation to create a hollow main antagonist for Luffy to fight, some sort of impossibly strong nightmare dream being, and I really don't want that to happen, because it's a very One Piece movie kind of solution to cop out by not fighting a real character with personal stakes and motivation, and instead taking on a big CGI spectacle monster. But this route does lend itself to a very boring solution like that, and I can only trust that Oda has a much better plan going forward. I like how Loki says none of you could even lift Ragnir. That confirms the theory of only Loki being able to lift Ragnir, kind of like Mjolnir. Yeah, this line is just begging for someone else to lift it. We now have a Chekhov's Ragnir, an object said to be unliftable, so like someone's got to lift it. Although it might just be because of how big Ragnir is, because every other giant looks puny compared to it. The scale in this chapter, it's probably off and we shouldn't take it too seriously, but in the panel where Loki says this, Ragnir looks like the slab at the top is pretty much the same size as Haradin or any of the other giants. And aside from some sort of Usopp dream ability combination, the only person who I think has the power to become big enough to lift it would be Luffy, which I would love to see. I would be so incredibly keen to watch Luffy wielding Ragnir, although it may also be a Mjolnir style condition where you need to be deemed worthy by Ragnir. In the Bible, briars grew in desolate barren land and often symbolize sin and judgment. They also indicate spiritual departure from and act as a barrier to God. So the symbolism of Saint Summers' abilities are pretty perfect, and it's not just Christianity either. Briars and thorns are this almost culturally universal symbol of negativity and spiritual barrenness, which is kind of perfect to remember of the Holy Knights, as the most spiritually barren part of this planet is definitely the Holy Land of Marijois, and as a Holy Knight, Summers serves as a barrier to this land and its residents. Although in Christianity, Jesus was also given a crown of thorns when he was crucified, which I do think also fits the Summers philosophy to know love is to wound one another, because in the end that was supposed to be an act of love. Love represented in one of the most visceral and brutal ways imaginable. Is it me, or Elbaph so far feels so small? It's not just you, or at the very least, it's just you and me, because I feel the same way. Elbaph is a really tricky island for scale, and I don't think that the art is the issue. The art is brilliant, and I'm always gobsmacked by the scale, but I think the issue is time and pacing. It takes no time at all for anyone to travel anywhere on Elbaph. Like, we've got Luffy at the Walrus School in one chapter, then at the village party the next, then at Castle West in the next chapter, and now suddenly he's all the way down in the underworld. And this really rapid and zippy cutting creates the illusion that Elbaph isn't very big at all, because it takes no time to get anywhere. It's like everything's on a teeny tiny island. So realistically, and I should say that this is not the fun way to do things, but to truly portray this scale, you would need to significantly slow down the pacing between locations in order to make Elbaph actually feel like it's bigger than any other island we visited. Because yes, I do see the scale with my eyes, but I don't feel the scale, if that makes sense. Because we travel across the island just as quickly, if not quicker, than any other island we've been on. And I'll say that this isn't a major issue for me, it's more a bit of meta intrigue, and I'm really not sure if there is a good way to give that scale to Elbaph without making everything feel so unbelievably slow. So you know what? It is what it is. I like that you can see that one kid's actual mum during the panel with all the giants freaking out. Alright, this is very important because I am so invested in this side story. One of the nightmares conjured was a kid's mother, because that kid saw her as the scariest possible thing that could destroy the world, more so than the sun god Inca. And in this chapter, I believe we do see the mother in question in this panel of all of the giants panicking. She has the same shape and the same sort of hair, and what I would love to see now is this real mother meeting the nightmare mother. And I think the funniest possible thing would be for the real mother to defeat the nightmare mother, and for the real mother to turn out to be even more terrifying than her child imagined. Now, I don't think that's something that's going to get a lot of focus if it does happen. If it did happen, it would be in the background like the rest of this tiny side story so far. But I really like these tiny side quests that Oda's putting into Elbaph for us to keep track of. For something a bit more important that gets overlooked in this chapter, we did have the revelation that Ylva, the giant girl who is currently at the front of Gunko's arrow line, is the great-great-granddaughter of Jarl. In this chapter, this was played for more of a moment of comedy, because drunk Jarl was stammering with his tongue out. But Jarl, he is one of the last remaining great warriors on this island. And I think if it comes down to it, he may 1,000,000% sacrifice himself for Ylva and do exactly what Saint Summers wanted. Because a true warrior of Elbaph isn't afraid of death, and I'm now starting to feel a little bit worried for Jarl, which is a pretty big shift because I've been quite wary of him so far. He's still in that potential traitor territory for me, but if he isn't a traitor, then I do think we're in for a tragic ending regardless. Because I don't think that Oda would create the system of the thorns causing more pain in direct correlation to quantity of love unless we were going to explore that effect, and Jarl has now become one of the main candidates for that. But there are others. There's a certain Colin on this island who has not one, but luckily 2 parents who love him, in theory. And while I don't see Ripley being ripped to pieces, it could be thematically appropriate for Scopper Gaban to take action if Colin gets ensnared, as he is the self-proclaimed missionary of love, and there's probably no one more philosophically suited to combat Saint Summers and show both he, as well as us and readers, the incredible power that is love. The left arm of the Pirate King has taken a big ol' swing. Mr. Jarl is acting very suspicious again, and as it turns out, Gunko has some rather controversial taste in music. But the biggest revelation of this chapter happens right at the beginning. I'm actually a bit taken aback by this chapter because I feel like the thing that should be the biggest reveal in this entire arc, maybe even this entire saga so far, was front-loaded and then promptly forgotten because of all of the action. But Ripley takes Frankie to what appears to be some sort of ancient laboratory, which is estimated by Lilith to be about 3,000 years old. So not only does this building predate the Void Century, but it does so comfortably by more than 2 millennia. In fact, there's only 2 confirmed things in the One Piece world that are older than this slab. One of which is the Palace of Alabama, which is 4,000 years old, and the other is, I guess, what remains of the Tree of Knowledge in Ohara, which was planted 5,000 years ago. The next oldest thing in the One Piece world would be the Golden City of Shandora. But even that was built almost 2,000 years after this lab on Elbaph. And it's a very interesting space because it's hard to tell at the moment whether it was built for giants or more human-sized individuals. From what we see of it, the scale looks to be very appropriate to Frankie, and like Ripley would have a rough time getting around the interior. And there's also a shot of Bonnie and Lilith waving out of a window, or I guess an ancient window, aka a hole in the wall that does look like it was made specifically for human sizing. But then again, in the next panel, the window is magically a lot more massive than in the previous. So as per usual, Elbaph scale art is very difficult to make judgments about because it's always drawn the way that it looks best in each individual panel, so there's not a lot of consistency, and as it should be, I guess. We like things that look good. But I'm very excited about this slab because we now know what Lilith's going to be spending her time doing, and she is going to lose her mind with this 3,000-year-old tech because that is something that none of the other Vegapunks ever had the privilege of studying. I also really like that Lilith said that she wanted to show it to Frankie because that Frankie-Vegapunk dynamic is very undercooked in my opinion. Frankie spent 2 years using Vegapunk's work as a parasocial mentor figure, and I just really want Frankie and Lilith to collaborate together on something, and this may be that something. However, we should not ignore that Oda is also tying Jewelry Bonnie to this location, and that may be because this new discovery of old technology could give us important insight or even an outright mechanism to restore Bartholomew Kuma. Because as much as Lilith said that she'd do it previously, I just wasn't sure if that was possible, and it felt like it might have been a bit of a forced happy ending to suddenly science our way out of that problem. But this lab gives us a pretty satisfying reason to turn that into potential reality. Although I am a bit worried about the building itself because it's in a very unsafe location right now. It's currently being attacked by the Thunder Nightmare, a very evil Zeus. And just a little thing about this encounter, the way that Bonnie responds to this threat is very cartoonish. The only thing that's missing from this reaction is the eye popping. But it's a very nice little inherited quality from Luffy, and she might be the one to deal with the evil yet kind of adorable Cloud by very briefly using the Nika form, which I'd actually really like to see because that would be a battle of Child's imagination versus Child's imagination. And we could see if Bonnie has been gifted enough hope and liberation to combat the various nightmares of the world. And of everyone on the island, you would need to think that Bonnie and Luffy are the ones best equipped to deal with these nightmares because they're the only ones that can tap into that purity of a child's mind. Elsewhere, a real star of this chapter for me is of course Brook. When the Draugr first appeared, I think a lot of our initial thoughts was, that dream creature sure does look a lot like Brook. And it was hilarious to hear Brook yell that, it's a giant me. And it might even be setting up a joke down the line. After all the nightmares have been beaten and all of the kids have been saved, that one kid who feared the Draugr wakes up and the first thing he sees is Brook and he is terrified. Before we move on from the Draugr though, one of the Elbaph giants says something very interesting, posing the question of, so it's not just a regular zombie? And this could be nothing. But to me, this implies that regular zombies are an accepted existence within this world, or at least on Elbaph. Even though the only way we've been able to create them thus far is with Gecko Moria's abilities. But what I also really appreciated about this section of the chapter was the detective duo that is Jinbei and Brook. They were both incredibly logical by grounding the chaos in the idea that this is almost certainly magical fruit related, and because of the sheer quantity of strange occurrences happening at the same time, Brook also flagged that we may be dealing with more than 2 intruders. The fruit maths makes a lot of sense. We've got nightmares, we've got thorns, we've got arrows, and they're not all going to be the same power. So we're dealing with at least 3 intruders. And here Nami also makes the decision to inform Jarl about Shamrock, or at least the man who looks like Shanks, which honestly I think it's insane that Nami of all people didn't do this earlier. We've known for quite a while that there have been at least 2 intruders on Elbaph, one of them suspiciously Shanks looking, but she just went back to drinking until, oh no, it's the problem that we knew about happening. Who could have predicted that? And just because I'm feeling extra paranoid this week, I'm wondering, right, if Jarl was the wrong person to tell this information to. We know that Shamrock had some sort of connection to King Harold, just because of the suggestion of Shamrock being here to visit his grave. So Jarl might hear tell of this scarlet-headed man and know exactly what's happening here. And subsequently, Jarl is also the one who tries to make sure that the Nami group do not get involved. He says, no, my treasured guests, you must not fight battle on our behalf. Please stay here and remain safe. Which I can't imagine most other giants would have suggested. I think that giants like Dory, Broggy, Oimo, Kashi, and even Colin would be proud to ride into battle with God Usopp on their side, as well as the rest of the brave Straw Hat warriors as well. Look, I'm probably being very unfair on Jarl, and I'm definitely actively searching for betrayal, but it's because he is 100% hiding something, that much we know. The dude was there when Loki allegedly killed Harold. He knows the truth. We just don't know if Jarl's hiding something for the better or for the worse yet. But something that I'm not seeing seeing anyone talk about is probably the biggest and worst thing that's ever happened to One Piece, which is that in this very chapter, 4 crew members have abandoned the Straw Hats and set sail under a new captain. Nami, Brook, Jinbei, and Usopp are now members of the Colin Pirates. And this was such an adorable section. Colin really does have that perfect child design, and it reminds me so much of Luffy. The face is quite simplistic, Colin's expressions are always clear and over the top, and when he genuinely smiles, it is like a burst of sunshine. So when Colin does get the Straw Hats to agree to let him be the captain, that is one of the most adorable things that has happened in this arc so far. And also, a thing it is that I want to flag is Colin dragging this sack of weapons behind him. This is a funny little panel because it looks like Colin's going overboard because he's keen for battle, but this could also end up arming the other Elbaph kids when they manage to wake up and give them all a chance to become brave warriors like their parents. Earlier in the chapter, Mr. Colin also flexed that he was Scopogaban's son, but I don't think that any of the Straw Hats were around to hear that. And what I'm really looking forward to is the group reacting to this information, because everyone here except Nami heard the story of Scopogaban, left arm of the Pirate King, at the party, and so there could be a pretty funny moment of them finding out that Colin is Scopogaban's son and everyone just being floored. And something that I think could go over a lot of people's heads in this chapter is that one page of the Holy Knights. Very important page. And if you're not properly in tune with One Piece, then this page could look like a bit of a waste of time. Because why are we bothering to spend time with Gunko listening to music? Well, it's because the song that she's listening to just so happens to be by Soul King Brook. The song is called New World, and it was announced in the manga, but we actually heard quite a bit of it in the anime, and there is a recording of the full track available online. But Brook wrote this song as a celebration of the new beginnings of the Straw Hat Pirates. He did it because Sabadi Archipelago was an island that held a lot of regret as well as the memory of their defeat, but Brook sees it as his role as musician to bring hope through entertainment. And so New World was a song designed to create a new memory of Sabadi, something to celebrate. And the thing that I love most about it is right before the song starts, Brook states, "Music is always on our side." Which was a cool line back then, but in modern One Piece, it has gone on to be extremely thematically relevant, so much more than anyone could have predicted. Because now the number one thing that seems to characterize who's on our side is those who dance to the drum beat of liberation. And this even goes as far as characters like Kizaru. If you're unaware, it was confirmed by Ichiro Oda that Kizaru was the one who gave Luffy the food on Egghead Island, and look, do you know why? Because just as Skeleton Man said, music is always on our side. And that there Marine Admiral was having the time of his life dancing to the drums of liberation during Bonnie's pizza party. So I started to speculate about this in the last chapter, but seeing Gunko listening to Brook's music, I have to ask again, if music is always on our side, then is this a sign that Gunko is going to flip and be on our side? Especially with St. Summers asking, what, Gunko, you're not happy with the current state of the world, or is this new old business? But the other interesting thing about choosing this song specifically is that Brook openly dedicated it to Luffy. Brook said at his concert that Straw Hat Luffy the pirate is alive, he'll be the king of all oceans. A calm, quiet departure doesn't fit him at all, oh baby. Now granted, Gunko probably wasn't at this concert, although it would be the most amazing flashback if she was, because it would have been real easy to just slip down from the holy land of Marijois to see the Soul King for a day. In fact, even easier if you can teleport. What am I saying? It doesn't even matter that Sabadi is so close to Marijois. It's just teleport. But when you look at what's happening right now, Gunko and the Holy Knights are having a very calm time on Elbaph, and Gunko is retreating from this calm to listen to a song dedicated to changing the world and a man who is the enemy of calm. So just how is Gunko going to react when she's in the same area as Luffy using Gear 5th and she hears the drums of liberation? And look, we can take this one massive step further. When Gunko's design was revealed, the internet did what the internet does and got very upset over the lack of pants. But here is the new conspiracy theory. Gunko is such a massive Soul King fan that she is dressed at all times ready and willing to show him panties. And panty vision is something of a lifestyle that's evolved for Gunko, being such a big fan, and we could be looking at the first successful panty viewing for Brook since he snuck under Big Mom's legs during Whole Cake Island. It's also mentioned that listening to this song, maybe not this song specifically, but this listening to music is part of a post-meal ritual for Gunko. Gunko herself doesn't want to use language quite as strong as that to describe it, but I think it's interesting that Oda does use that language in his dialogue, and it almost gives me the impression of saying a prayer or saying grace before dinner. Whatever it is, it's evidently very important to Gunko, and I just find it very intriguing to see the language of ritual being used to describe someone performing an act that is not in worship of the world nobles, and in fact in direct opposition against them, whether Gunko knows it or not. She's definitely a much more interesting character than I gave her credit for in her introduction. And it's gotten to the point where, yeah, I do still miss Shamrock quite dearly, but Gunko is now the holy knight that I'm most fixated on because there's a lot going on here. Just as there was a lot going on inside of Dory and Broggy, which is what delayed them so long. And as soon as it was mentioned that Dory and Broggy were still in the bathroom, mate, I knew exactly what was happening. Because I had a lot of friends in uni who used to practice this, I guess we'll call it strategy. They would never pace themselves and they'd all get horrendously drunk by 10 or 11 p.m. and then go off to the bathroom for a strategic ejection so that they could continue drinking. And seeing Hakoku sovereignty is always a treat no matter who's performing it. It's usually Dory and Broggy, but there was that one time where Big Mom and Kaido did their own improvised version of it, and I can't help but feel that by the end of this arc, we could see this attack being used by Harudin and Loki, and have them both symbolically inherit leadership that way. But alongside Dory and Broggy is Mr. Scopa-Gaban, and I'm really glad to see him here, because I don't think we got anywhere near enough of a showcase during his brief clash with Luffy, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this man got the nickname of Mountain Eater outside of the bedroom. With that said, I do have a bad feeling about Scopa-Gaban showing up here, because from a storytelling perspective, the fact that he's here right now, his presence, it diffuses all tension. The Holy Knights have been putting in some good work, yes, but I still don't see them as a particularly big deal without Shamrock. And if Scopa-Gaban, of all people, the left wing of the Pirate King, is deciding to tap in here, then surely there is nothing that can stop him. Like if Silver's Ray Lee were to rock up right now, you would feel like victory is guaranteed, and I feel the same with Gaban. Which is why I'm very worried about what's going to happen next. Because stories aren't particularly interesting without any dramatic tension. So this would be a prime opportunity for Oda to escalate the threat once more. And yes, this might be wishful thinking from me, but one way to do that would be to reveal that Shamrock has disobeyed orders and is still on the island. Because if Figgle and Shamrock was to come face to face with Scopa-Gaban, then the outcome of that clash is something I cannot predict, and if anything, I would be worried that Scopa-Gaban, very much not in his prime, could fall to Shamrock. But I'm not worried about that happening with Saint Summers, Gunko, or killing him. And this does remind me of Egghead Island. There were a lot of moments where that arc felt very firmly in our control, the way that Elbaph does with the activation of Gaban. But every time Egghead felt under control, Oda immediately escalated the threat and kept us on a pretty relentless knife's edge all throughout the arc. So I just can't see things being anywhere near as simple as the end of the chapter may have us believe. And you've always got to keep this in mind. What would be the greatest dramatic gut punch in any situation? And in this situation, I think that smack punch would be for the guy who was called invincible to be wounded, defeated, or otherwise removed. If that happens, then we're in trouble. Then we are feeling the tension. So for now, I'd say enjoy this high while it lasts, because unless Elbaph is about to be a very short and unsatisfying arc, I dare say that we've got some pain incoming. I don't know from who or from where, but just don't say that I didn't warn you. Gunko saying New World is her favorite song. Isn't that a hint that she is a revolutionary and acting as Dragon Spy? So this is a very popular idea of late. And one of the main criticisms I had when Gunko was first introduced was that her character design seemed a little bit meh. At the time I said something along the lines of edgy koala, like someone made fan art of evil koala, but maybe there's something to the thought that she is somehow related to Koala, perhaps organizationally or even familiarly as Koala's sister, because Koala was taken to be a slave on Marijois. She managed to escape thanks to Fisher Tiger and return back to her home island, but what if her sister was also taken and wasn't quite as lucky, or didn't want to go? And it could even be a step worse than that. Koala and Gunko may even have been abducted using a similar game to what's happening right now with the Thorns of St. Summers, and their parents were completely powerless to stop it. It's obviously a big stretch, and I don't think that going that far is particularly likely. A lot of connections being made here, primarily due to the fact that they both wear the same general kind of pumpy hat with goggles on the front. But I do have to say, it's not just Koala that we're connecting Gunko to, because most of the main Revolutionary Army characters possess that aesthetic as well. Sabo, Morley, Lindbergh, Bello, Betty all have hats with goggles, and most members tend to favor goggles in general, like Ginny, Gambo, Ahiro, Ushiano, Jiren, and more, many more. Oda has a very clear aesthetic for the Revolutionary Army, and it's one that, whether this is intentional or not, Gunko has now been connected to, which has also led to the rise of the thought that Gunko may not be a current but former member of the Revolutionary Army who was recruited, or maybe it can be a mix of both. Gunko was a well-known revolutionary who was recruited, but is still acting as a double agent in her role within the Holy Knights. At the moment, I'm not confident leaning in either direction, because her listening to Brook's song New World and Summer's asking, Gunko, mate, are you dissatisfied with this current world? What's going on? That makes me believe that Gunko is looking for a change. Maybe not actively, but it's something that deep down she desires. But whether it's Gunko or not, I do think that Dragon having a spy within the world government, perhaps even within the Holy Knights itself, does make a lot of sense, as he does seem to know all of the world government's major moves in advance, and he does seem to have something of an extensive knowledge of the Holy Knights themselves, and to have that knowledge, well, I think it would be most helpful to have someone infiltrate their ranks. And things could go on to be real depressing from here, because Gunko could be having this post-meal ritual of listening to Brook's song as something of a reaffirmation of her beliefs. Because right now, she's leading children to their deaths, so maybe this song is a reminder that all of this horror, all of this child slaying is being conducted for the sake of building a new world, an almost Sakazuki-esque belief in sacrifice for the greater good. But if it was Gunko, a big question I do have is, does Gunko know about Imu? Just like the hat and goggles with Koala, Gunko has been pretty relentlessly compared to Imu because of her arrow powers, and how we saw Imu use something quite similar to kill Cobra and chase Sabo. And it's all speculation, everything is, but the idea here would be that if Gunko knows about Imu, then why didn't Dragon or any of the Revolutionary Army even know that Imu existed before Sabo crashed the Reverie? But then again, there's no guarantee that she's working for Dragon, and also no guarantee that Gunko and the Holy Knights do know about Imu. Because yeah, they're using the teleportation pentagrams, but they might just think that it's an ability of the Elder Stars. So all I know is that there's more to Gunko, and who knows, we might even be on the completely wrong track here, with the Imu connections turning out to be correct instead, and Gunko could go on to become the main antagonist of Elbaph. Is TD, the brand of headphones Gunko's using, a reference to anything? Yes, it is absolutely a reference, but mate, it is obscure. In the SBS of Volume 64, Eiichiro Oda described Brook's business model as a rock star, and stated that music sales are conducted through TDs, which stands for tone dial. So headphones in the One Piece world are a glorified pair of tone dials strapped to your ears, and they can't just play any music you want them to. Oh no. They can only play the music that's been recorded on them. So imagine needing a separate pair of headphones for every song you want to listen to. Being a music fan requires quite a bit of commitment in the One Piece world. Mr. Internet Man, Brook's line saying he expected more than 2 intruders reminded me that he used to be the leader of a convoy in his old kingdom. Yes, that is something I never want people to forget. Brook has this mysterious hidden history that has yet to be revealed to us. When he was introducing himself, Brook said that he was the leader of a battle convoy in a quote certain kingdom, and given how often quote certain kingdoms and quote certain men turn out to be vague allusions to ridiculously important plot points, I fully expect Brook's pre-pirate history on this certain island to become quite relevant in the future, perhaps even integral to Luffy becoming the Pirate King. I like when Killingham told Summers not to make fun of Gunko's music taste. Kind of a chill dude so far. It is very unusual for a world noble to care about someone who isn't themselves, and especially so considering Gunko's status as a not world noble. I can't imagine, say, St. Charles telling his sister to leave their guards alone because them guards, they're free to have whatever personal hobbies and interests they desire. Nah, he's not doing that. Now granted, St. Killingham is currently complicit in child abduction and soon to be child murder, or at least attempted child murder, because they're all about to walk into that big old fire and no one seems to care about it other than the fact that that could ruin the game. But all of that aside for now, St. Killingham still seems like a really nice guy. And there is an idea regarding his awakening. St. Killingham is so far the only fully awakened Zoan antagonist who has white smoke surrounding him. Rob Lucci, Kaku, and all the older stars were surrounded with black smoke because they're bad, very bad, whereas Luffy and Yamato, 2 protagonists, have white smoke because they're good, quite good. So that could be a sign that St. Killingham isn't a bad guy at heart, and so he could be a natural candidate to flip sides, but I do have a bit more difficulty seeing that with him than I do with Gunko. Just because this is St. killing him. So there's a lot more work to be put into redeeming a full world noble than it would be for Gunko, although it has been done before. If St. Don Quixote Moscard could get his redemption, then I suppose killing him can as well. Here's the thing, we're gonna know fairly quickly, because Oda tends to have quite a strict writing policy for characters that end up flipping sides. If you look back on the antagonist to protagonist pipeline, Oda usually makes sure not to have any of those characters perform any truly despicable acts, at least not ones that we see on screen. That's the important part. They can do horrible things, we just can't see them do it. That's why we never actually saw Saint Moscard do any typical world noble behavior, and with Gunko and killing him, I'm starting to feel the same way about them as I did with Ulti and Page 1, who do now appear to be firmly falling into the good guy camp. Those two were misguided individuals who, in theory, were responsible for a lot of unforgivable crimes. Who knows how many Wano citizens starved to death under their watch, but because we didn't see any of that on Page, they're just lovable, goofy dinosaurs. So what we're on the lookout for is a line for killing him and Gunko to cross. If they cross that line, they're done. But if not, then there's a good chance that they'll go on to have a redemption journey. And I would be especially interested to see killing him on that path because his Devil Fruit ability seems almost designed for the core mission of One Piece, which is to make dreams come true. And the combination of St. Killingham and Monkey D. Luffy would be unstoppable. Luffy inspires and makes people believe that anything is possible, and then Killingham can manifest that anything that those people can now vividly picture. I wonder if Bonnie's Age Fruit would bring back Scopogaban to his prime so he can fight at his full power. So the answer is yes, it could. But new question, is Bonnie going to do it? The answer to that is probably not. And there's no satisfying in-world logic for why not. It's more about the themes of One Piece, which is that the next generation are the ones who now need to stand up and take charge of the future. We can't keep relying on an ever-diminishing pool of old men to protect us. And so as cool as it would be to see Scopogaban fight in his prime even briefly, I think it's more likely that Bonnie would be used to do something like age up Colin, and have Colin show us that he's ready to take up his father's role, at least in terms of spirit and willpower. And that's if Jewelry Bonnie gets used like that at all. At the moment, I've noticed that O's kept her pretty deliberately over here, separated from all of the other main groups on Elbaph. And that may simply be to avoid dealing with the narrative logic of, well, why doesn't Bonnie just snap her fingers and solve the problem? Because I imagine it's much easier to just keep her somewhere over there for the sake of drama. And there was also an idea proposed during Egghead Island that Bonnie would age Luffy up, which in retrospect I don't think works at all. It's a very painfully logical way for Luffy to gain more punch power, to give him a body more akin to Prime Garp, but it also ruins the thematic nature of winning via the imagination of the inner child. So I think that Oda's going to very carefully narratively quarantine Jewelry Bonnie, just to make sure that we never have to answer those annoying logical questions. I don't mean to actually, but actually, this song could potentially also be in reference to New World by Ado, who is sang by Uta in Film Red. I've seen a lot of confusion about this, and quite understandably so, because Film Red does have a song by Ado which has New World in the lyrics of the chorus. So if you're just listening to the song, it sounds like the song is called New World, but that song's name is actually New Genesis, so this isn't a reference to Uta. How did Colin not get affected by Killingham's Devil Fruit? Why is he not at school like the other kids? So earlier on in the arc, there is a scene with Colin at the school, and the kids, right, they tease him and say that he doesn't even go to school. So that's why he wasn't there, because Colin doesn't go to school. Question for Internet Man. Out of all of the dreams each of the Straw Hats have, whose dream will be most likely implied but not shown at the end of One Piece? Nami's would be mine. So that's an interesting question, and I appreciate that you donated 10 whole dollary dues to ask it. Because this goes into the discussion of tangible versus intangible dreams within the Straw Hats. Some crew members have these extremely tangible yet difficult to attain dreams, whilst others are a lot harder to even grasp. One dream I've always found quite difficult is Chopper's. He wants to cure all disease, which is crazy ambitious, so I think that would probably be my answer. At the end of One Piece, I don't think we'll literally see Chopper cure all disease, but we might see him innovate some sort of compound that'll go on to revolutionize medical treatment around the world, and it'll be implied that eventually all of that disease not going to be a problem anymore. Otherwise, I think that Usopp is also a pretty good answer. I'm not sure if we'll ever get a panel of him literally being announced as a brave warrior of the sea. It'd be more on us to see Usopp having stepped into that role. Or it'd be on a child of the next generation to see or read about Usopp's legend and say, mate, that guy's a pretty brave warrior of the sea. Colin, before Gaban was revealed as his father, my father was a powerful pirate. Colin, now that it's revealed that Gaban is his father, I'm the son of Gaban. Yeah, look, I get what you're saying. And this is a very long-standing One Piece tradition of convenient dialogue. I think one of the worst offenders of this was Charlotte Lola on Thriller Bark when she gave Nami a piece of Big Mom's Vivia card, claiming that her mother was a big shot pirate in the New World, because it's not a natural way to communicate. What you do is you give Nami the paper and you tell her that it belongs to Charlotte Lin, Emperor of the Sea. Or if you're Nami, what you do is you respond to Lola's statement with, really, what's your mother's name so that I know who I'm looking for with the magical paper? But with that said, that's just not the exciting way to do things. It's much more fun to leave the question mark hanging, and then when Whole Cake Island comes around, get hit with the revelation that yes, Big Mom is the owner of the Vivia card, and that's who Lola was talking about all the way back then. I should say it's not just One Piece, and it's not even just manga in general. This happens in all forms of media. Information for plot reasons needs to not be known. And so sometimes it's a bit frustrating because when you're looking at it, the characters often seem like they're deliberately miscommunicating. Something that real people would never do. However, I do think that Oda tends to handle it quite well, or at least as well as it can be. Did you notice Jinbei's eyes when Nami was raging about whoever kidnapped and endangered the children? So it's a bit hard to tell because Jinbei, he's always quite empathetic and serious when it comes to general no goodliness being done. But here he does seem particularly no nonsense. The way he's looking at Nami while she talks about essentially what happened to her as a child due to Jinbei's decision to free Arlong gives this page a lot more weight than it otherwise would have. By putting these two characters together, it's not just about Jinbei realizing the true severity of the situation, but it's also designed to get us as readers to be able to connect with the children of Elbaph. Because look, I don't know if what I'm about to say next is controversial, but kidnapping and harming children is a bad thing. We all know that it's a bad thing, and because of that, it's not good. But it usually takes a bit more than just knowing that a bad thing happened to elicit a genuine emotion from people. And with these giant kids, we don't really know them. And because this is fiction, it's even more of a difficult task to get a reader to genuinely care about these drawings. Which is why here Oda's tying their situation to Nami's hellish childhood, because we do know and care about her. It's the sort of emotional withdrawal an author can make from the story bank only after 3 decades of very diligent deposits. You forget Internet Man Ray Lee's words when he saved Boa Hancock. He's not as strong as they used to be. I don't feel that Gaban here diffuses anything. I feel it means he might die or get hurt. So I do kind of agree with the last part of that, but only because him being here right now is too good. We are in such a good position that something terrible needs to happen. So look, Ray Lee did say that he didn't think he would win if he went all out against Blackbeard, but here's the thing, we are not dealing with a Blackbeard level threat on Elbaph, at least not yet. And my point in the review video was that if Rayleigh showed up right here and now, and all we're looking at is Summers killing him and Gunko, then I wouldn't be feeling at all worried, because none of them really embody the kind of peak threat that Blackbeard would. And that's exactly how I feel with Scopper Gaban stepping in as well, and why I think something very bad could be about to happen, because we need a threat to cancel him out. Whether that's Summers stepping up, Shamrock returning, Loki going berserk, or even an element that we're not yet aware of. The lab looks like a robot head. You know what? It kinda does. I don't know if this is just pareidolia, but the top of the lab does look like a janky ancient robot, although it is human nature to see faces in just about anything. A lot of people are 100% convinced that the lab is a robot, and look, maybe it is. But with most of the people who are convinced, it's not because they read the chapter and came to that conclusion themselves. Because this week, the tech spoiler leakers said that Ripley took Frankie to a 3,000-year-old robot like Emmett, which I think was a very irresponsible thing to say, and has now colored the impression of the facility for anyone who read those spoilers. Although I will say that the top of this facility is very evocative of the Laputa Castle in the Sky robots, which may or may not be relevant because this film is theorized to have inspired a lot of Oda's decisions in One Piece, which is probably best covered in a video of its own. New World is going to be this generation's Binks' Sake. That is a very cool idea, because if we're right about the purpose of Binks' Sake, then the world doesn't really need it post-dawn. Currently, Binks' Sake is thought to be like a pirate version of the Harley text, the true history of the world passed down through oral tradition that began on the very first crew led by the very first pirate, the Joy Boy. It's a song with a purpose to be fulfilled, something important to this world. But if we're gonna destroy this world, then we'd be looking for something new to characterize the next world. And perhaps a song titled New World would do just nicely for that. And on another note, I also really like the idea of one of Brooks' songs enduring and having an even longer lasting legacy than his effectively immortal self. But even if it's swiftly forgotten by history, it does seem to be having a very important purpose right here and now. He may not mean for it to have been taken like this, but Gunko may be only the first of many. Brooks' song could inspire or currently be inspiring hundreds of thousands of people all throughout the planet to dream of a better world. Because it's quite a revolutionary bop if you read the lyrics. Stuff like, go fight 100 times for a new world. The world is about to change. Today is the day. May I see your panties? That gets said a lot. But all of these very profound and inspiring lyrics are found within this song. And I know it's mostly just a joke at this point, but I do think it's very possible that Gunko doesn't wear pants because of the line in this song about seeing panties. And if so, I would love to see how that line impacts history. Just think, 1,000 years from now, fictional pirate scholars are going to be looking back on this as some sort of grand metaphor for discarding the shackles of the world and proudly displaying the undergarments of the human soul in a grand act of liberation. Loki's idol has been revealed, and it is Roxy Zebek, a man so terrible that the world government conspired to remove his name from the history. A man who was once called Goldie Roger's greatest rival, more so than Whitebeard, more so than Garp. And on Elbaph, we have a modern day meeting of this inherited rivalry with Luffy and Loki. But before we get into anything else, something that is extremely worthy of acknowledgement this week is the color spread, because this is a special guest color spread, and I'm not sure if that's ever happened before. At the very least, I can't recall if it has. But this image was drawn by Midori Matsuda, who's been a character designer and animation director for the One Piece anime, which is celebrating its official return after a 6-month break. And I love the spread with all the Straw Hats just chilling and watching the actual Egghead Island anime, except for Zoro, who even sitting down in a room surrounded by TVs is still going in the wrong direction. And on the clock in this color spread, you can see that it's 11:15 p.m. That's because the One Piece time slot has now changed. It airs at 11:15 p.m. in Japan, whereas it used to air at 9:30 a.m. And it's speculated that part of the time slot change was to get rid of all the censorship that comes with airing a show in a kid's TV time slot, but I am extremely excited to check out the Egghead anime return. I'm hoping that this break has fixed all of the pacing issues, and that more breaks are going to be taken in the future to keep the pacing solid. But into the chapter itself, the opening was extremely chill considering everything else happening on Elbaph at the moment. And what we actually have here is over 1,000 chapters of character development all coming to fruition. I was initially a bit confused to see a dinosaur on Elbaph because yes, this island has big creatures, but I didn't think it was a prehistoric island like Little Garden. But then it hit me. Little Garden. This arc is often flagged as the true beginning of the Zoro-Sanji rivalry, which we saw hints of on Baratie, and they did get into a fight about Nami's breast size in Kokoyashi Village. Or at least that's what Sanji thought they were fighting about. But on Little Garden, they had their hunting contest to see who could bag the biggest of the beasts, something that drove Zoro and Sanji apart for the entire arc, and yet here we are, more than 1,000 chapters later on Elbaph, again on a giant-themed island, but this time Zoro and Sanji are working together to hunt a dinosaur. And they're not just hunting together, no, they are actively working together. And they're using the same technique that they innovated on Long Ring Longland, Armée de l'Air, where Sanji launches Zoro at a giant opponent to give him that increased speed and force to take it down. And the creature they're aiming at on Elbaph is a Groggysaurus. Funny name, sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? And that's because they originally used this combo attack during the Groggy Ring game. So Oda's really slapping us in the face with nostalgia right from the get-go in this here chapter. And there's been a lot of flags recently that's made me quite hyper aware of just how comparatively soon One Piece is ending. Luffy becoming an emperor, we've got almost all the road poneglyphs, and the fact that we're even on Elbaph, that is very endgame material. But nothing has made me feel more like the end is near than to finally see Zoro and Sanji voluntarily working together in a non-life or death situation. And in addition to this landmark moment of teamwork, this opening section, pretty chill opening section, also contains some pretty vital lore via Goldberg. It's been suspected that his shield, now named Nash, was a homie ever since we first saw it on the Straw Hat Grand Fleet cover page, simply because, well, what else could it be? And as it turns out, yeah, it is a homie, but it is not one created by Big Mom. Nash was given life 63 years ago during the incident with Charlotte Lin Lin during the winter solstice, where very young Charlotte Lin Lin went on a bit of a rampage, similar, rah, and it was used by Goldberg's father, meaning that Nash was created by Mother Carmel. That's very important because Mother Carmel is quite dead, but Nash is not, which answers a long-standing question we've had about Big Mom. The last time we saw her was during her refreshing lava bath with Kaido, and one of the main reasons why it's been hard to assume that she's dead despite sinking into lava is because, well, firstly, it's One Piece, you can't ever assume death, but secondly, because Zeus is still alive, and we didn't know how the Soul Saw fruit functioned after death. But it appears that homies that are given life are not bound to the life of the fruit user, even homies created directly from the soul of that user. So Big Mom could genuinely be dead. We could go the rest of One Piece, never see her again, and just assume that there was no way that she or Kaido could have survived. And right now, the only thing that makes me stop and question her life status is Charlotte Pudding, because she had this little clap back at the Blackbeard Pirates about what her mother was gonna do to them if she's still alive, which I could see being a bit of foreshadowing for Big Mom to rock up and go on a Blackbeard Pirate rampage. I mean, she has every reason to. After Wano, they're the ones who invaded her territory, beat up her children, and abducted her pudding. Anyway, Nash, the shield, is 63 years old, which makes him older than Kaido and 2 years younger than Dr. Vegapunk, who was 65 years old at the time of his maybe death. Do you ever look at people who were born around the same time as you and wonder, where did my life go wrong? For example, Novak Djokovic, he's only 2 years older than me, but he's won 24 career Grand Slams and I've won 0. Although again, he is 2 years older than me, so I've got time to catch up. But that's how I imagine Nash feels about his life compared to Vegapunk. Sure, you've slammed your face into some dinosaurs, but how many limitless energy sources have you provided for all of humanity, Although I can tell you that Luffy's doing his best to provide energy on a much smaller scale. Luffy has assumed a pretty hilarious role at the moment, acting as Loki's sort of nurse, his meat nurse, shoving horrifically hot food in his mouth and spilling scalding soup on him. It's one of those moments that reminds me that sometimes Luffy can be far more dangerous as an ally than he is as an enemy. When Luffy genuinely cares about you, there may be something to fear. Although I really liked Gerd's thumbs up, approving of Luffy's accidental actions. As a doctor, I imagine that she does have some sort of moral duty of care to Loki, but she still wants to inflict as much pain as possible on him without risking any serious injury and or death. And that sort of winking thumbs up is never used well in One Piece. There is always something sinister behind it. Like when we saw a very motivational image of Frankie doing it in the distance after he self-destructed Vegapunk's lab on Karakuri Island. The whole thing is almost Boa Hancock-esque. You strike this pose because it's like, yeah, I know what I did was wrong, but you'll forgive me because I'm very cute. But one of the more interesting parts about this chapter was that moment of bonding between Luffy and Loki, with both of them finding out that they have their respective idolized pirating mentors. For Luffy, that's Shanks, which is a big sore spot for Loki as the man who defeated him. But of all the things I wasn't expecting, Loki's equivalent of Shanks was Rox D. Zebek. And we even have a tantalizingly short and very obscured flashback of Loki trying to join the Rox pirates. In retrospect, I don't know why I didn't expect this. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've even mentioned now on multiple occasions that Loki's goal is extremely similar to Rox's goal, if not outright the same. So of all of the people in this world, of course, Loki's gonna look up to Rox. And that's one more thing that is potentially setting up a larger conflict with Luffy, as Loki wants to follow in the path of Rox, whilst Luffy is taking on the will of Rox's greatest rival, Roger. But what we've done here is continue the trend of great pirates saying no to annoying children. Shanks, of course, did this right at the beginning of the series with Luffy, and much more recently on Elbaph with Colin. But Roger was also approached by a child who wanted to join his crew. That child's name was Pedro, and Roger said, nah, mate. And now we've got Rox being approached by Loki, who reacted rather violently, perhaps too violently. I just want to linger on the fact that Oda chose Edward Newgate to be placed in this scene, because the contextual decision-making in this chapter is pretty disgustingly seemingly deliberate. Oda could have chosen any Rocks pirate or any number of Rocks pirates to put in this scene, but he chose Whitebeard because Whitebeard's dream was to have a family. So seeing Rocks reject a child continues to tell the story of placing these two characters at odds and making me even more curious as to how Rocks managed to recruit Whitebeard in the first place. And sure, this may sound like the rambling wankery of a man on the internet, but consider this. Whitebeard never turned down a request to join his crew. He may have played a little bit hard to get, as he did with Kozuki Oden, but Whitebeard never rejected a potential son. And the one time we did see him recruit a child, it turned out to be Marshall D. Teach, who would eventually orchestrate the death of Whitebeard. And there's no doubt in my mind that part of the reason why Whitebeard let Teach join the crew was because of this experience. Whitebeard here feels a lot of empathy for Loki, like, Rocks, mate, you didn't have to beat the crap out of him that badly. And so when a similar situation came around for Whitebeard, Whitebeard wanted to handle it his way, the daddy way. And it's quite devious, since Teach is heavily hinted to be the man who did inherit the will of Rocks D. Zebek, and begging Whitebeard as a child to join his crew is now starting to feel almost like Blackbeard knew Whitebeard's weakness to children and family, and he took advantage of that. As for how this alleged child would know that, I don't know. But we do know now that Rocks knew. So this meta mystery just got a lot more interesting. At first, I was also a bit taken aback as to why Rocks didn't accept Loki's request to join the crew, because Rocks was more than happy to have Kaido come aboard, who joined the Rocks Pirates when he was only 15 years old, although that wasn't necessarily Rocks' decision. Kaido was actually invited to join the crew by Whitebeard, although it was said that Rocks wanted to meet Kaido. So if Rocks encountered Kaido first, then maybe things would have gone the same way. I don't know, maybe it is just a skill issue. Child Loki wasn't anywhere near Kaido's level. And I suppose the best way to put it is that Loki, when he challenged Zebek, was about like 20 years old at most. The God Valley incident and Zebek's defeat happened almost 40 years ago, and Loki's 63 years old. So at most, he's in his early 20s when he challenges Rocks here, which is about the same age as Colin. So maybe one way you can look at this is that this was the equivalent of Colin trying to challenge Shanks. And Loki claims that he was born in the wrong era, which if his dream is truly to destroy the world, then, he's probably correct. If he'd been slightly older during the era of Rocks, then he would have joined them, and Loki's power, which is now considered to be worth a 2 billion berry threat, could have tipped the entire God Valley incident in favor of Rocks and doomed the world to whatever that path was going to be. So I'm kind of torn on what happens from here. Do we repeat the past? Do we inherit the wills and have Loki become one of perhaps even the greatest of Luffy's rivals? Or do we change destiny? Do we mold our own wills, and do we join forces to overcome a much greater mutual enemy? Right now, elsewhere, Scopogaman has very quickly and easily dealt with the Nightmare Loki, pointing out what we suspected, which is that the kids have no idea how truly powerful and horrifying Loki can be. So their imagination wasn't enough to reach Loki's true heights, or indeed the heights of those other suspected nightmare creatures. And I have to say that things are continuing to go quite well for now. Across the board, nightmare creatures are falling. Here, Saul also beat Fenrir, and Dory and Broggy are just plowing through the Draugr and the ghosts laughing the whole time. And then Jinbei even rocks up just in time to put out that fire that was going to kill all of the children, much like he put out the flames on Onigashima thanks to Raizo's water scroll, and once again proving the worth of having a water type in your team in all scenarios. But during this section, there's a very curious moment where Gunko and Summers are speaking to one another as the kids are about to walk into the flames. And this is a case where I'll cement my opinion with the official translation, because at the moment I do think this can be taken either way. Summers is asking Gunko whether or not the kids are going to wake up if they walk into the fire because he's trying to get hard or something. He gets off on this. And Gunko responds with an excruciatingly detailed report from the future of exactly what's going to happen to them. And on the one hand, you could read this as Gunko displaying that rather sadistic world noble trait of gleefully enjoying what's happening, breaking it down step by step as if savoring a meal. Or you could take it as a very neutral and factual, maybe even disgusted, straightforward answer to St. Summers' question. Summers is definitely the only one taking clear pleasure in what's happening here, and this might just be my agenda, but I don't think that Gunko is. Because we've already seen her happy and content when she's eating the food and listening to the music, and this doesn't look like that at all. And maybe there's some reason behind the choice to keep her face covered, maybe in order to hide her true true feelings whenever this sort of world noble shenaniganry happens, and she just needs to stand there and watch. Meaning that Gunko is now face to face with Brook, and I wasn't expecting them to come into contact so quickly. So I'm thinking that it is now or never for Brook. It is panty time. With the masterful twist being that he can already see said panties, and this could play into both of Brook's jokes. He could ask to see panties, then claim that he can already see them, but then state that he doesn't have eyes, thus giving us our very first hybrid skull panty joke. We all know where Brook's attention is going to be going. But of course, I'm infinitely more curious about Gunko because she doesn't appear to realize that Brook is on the ship yet. And I suppose it is possible that Gunko doesn't know Soul King Brook by face. She may have just found the TD with New World recorded on it and kept it, in which case Brook asking for panties may become a surprisingly important plot point because that could be how Gunko recognizes him. This is a bit of a stretch though, because I don't even know if this is canon in the One Piece manga, probably not, because the New World lyrics have never been revealed in the manga. But in the anime and on the officially released soundtrack, Brook asks politely yet belligerently to see panties during the song. So if Gunko doesn't immediately recognize Brook, then perhaps she will recognize his lyrical mastery, or at the very least think that he's also a fan of the song. All in all though, it's hard not to be feeling quite confident at the end of this chapter. The fire's been put out, the nightmare creatures are falling, Gunko is now facing off directly against 4 Straw Hats with 2 more in the general vicinity, and Loki's having a lovely meal, so he should be up and running quite shortly. Despite the fact that Gerd said it would take him months to recover, that's not going to happen. Or if it does, I guess Loki's going to fight with his wounds during this arc. And so now I'm really just waiting for the next big thing to hit. Right now we look dangerously close to cleaning up this problem without Luffy, Zoro, or Sanji even needing to be involved, which I just can't imagine is how this arc ends. And one character we don't see in this chapter is Saint Killingham, and that does worry me because he could pop up anywhere. Given how Gunko seems fixated on Colin at the end of the chapter, Killingham could be ready and waiting to put Colin to sleep and bring out his greatest fear, which I would love to see. Or the escalation could switch to bringing out the greatest fears of the adults, and thus conjuring a Loki much closer to the power of the real Loki. Because every adult giant has fought Loki at this point, they needed all of them to bring him under command, so all the giants are hyper aware of Loki's true power, and their nightmares may even exaggerate it, unlike the kids who underestimated. Or we can also take things a step further and bring out the fears of the Straw Hats, which I think would be really fun, and we do still have the mystery of Loki's devil fruit to solve, which could bring us a lot of trouble as well. But whatever the case may be, I don't think we're ready to wrap things up here, and things are only going to get a lot worse on Elbaph before they permanently get better, if indeed they do permanently get better. What if Loki passes out again at some point due to his wounds, and Killingham pulls out a dream version of Rox D. Zebek? Now that would be a pretty insane escalation. Like how I never could have predicted that all 5 elderly old men were going to show up and transform and do the fight battling on Eckert Island. Elbaph is definitely not where I would have seen Rock showing up in any way, shape, or form, and there's so very few ways to actually escalate threats any higher in One Piece anymore. After beating Kaido and humiliating the old men, we are very much slamming our heads against that power ceiling, but somehow getting Rocks involved would be a great way to push things beyond that very Kaido-shaped ceiling. The thing is that Loki would need to be thinking about Rocks beforehand for this to work, assumedly. As far as we know, that's how Killingham's Devil Fruit ability functions. So now would be a pretty great time to strike if that's what we're after while Loki's reminiscing. But if Loki was to be affected by this power, I'm not sure if Rocks would be our answer. Yes, he's Loki's greatest idol and he's a pretty cool dude. But another option may be to pull out Loki's vision of King Harold and confront all of Elbaph with Harold's true nature. Because there's a very interesting potential idea at play here, as Loki is traditionally a liar in whatever incarnation he appears in all media, and One Piece is no exception. He might not be lying, but at the very least, the Loki here is known as a liar. However, dreams cannot lie. So if a conjured Harold comes into play that would show how Loki saw him with no room for questioning whether or not Loki's telling the truth, then that could be pretty confronting. The accuracy of the portrayal of Harold could be argued, but what cannot be argued would be Loki's genuine belief in what Harold Harold was. And something else I want to mention though is another parallel between Zoro and Loki. Those two were both introduced in the exact same way, both being punished by being tied up to stuff. But after nothing happened on Thriller Bark, very boring arc, Luffy tended to the on the brink of death Zoro in the same way that he tends to Loki in this chapter. Luffy brought Zoro a barrel of booze and tried to force it down his throat, thinking that alcohol was Zoro's health potion, in the same way that he recovers by eating meat. And speaking of Zoro, something else I didn't notice until I went back on the chapter. In the panel where he's eating meat, he's doing so off one of his swords, and it's difficult to tell whether it's Enma or the Sandai Kitetsu. I don't think it's the Wado. I'd probably say it's the Sandai Kitetsu because Zoro tends to use that in his left hand, which is his meat holding hand now, whilst the right hand was for Enma, and before that Shusui, and before that Yubashiri. And so I think this shows a very fun contrast in Zoro's blade mastery. On Wano, Zoro could barely lift Enma without it sucking him dry of haki, and things do seem to have gotten a lot better now, but it's hard to imagine that Zoro's gotten to the stage where his mastery over Enma is so great that it's happy to be used as a kitchen utensil. Whereas the Sandai Kitetsu is a sword that Zoro's been mastering for more than 2 years now. It was initially quite a problem child, but now it is well and truly tamed. Rox being Loki Shanks gives us the terrifying possibility of Loki joining Blackbeard. Alright, even if Loki was to go full antagonist, which I still don't think he's going to, even if he was to do that, I look at it as almost a reverse Rox situation. I do think that Blackbeard would be more than happy for Loki to join his crew, absolutely thrilled, but it is so incredibly difficult to see a man of Loki's modern day ambition willingly bending the knee and becoming subservient to anyone, most of all, Mr. Blackbeard. Because Blackbeard and Rox, the more we see of Rox, the less he looks like Blackbeard. And this might just be because of the impression of Blackbeard that Oda's been giving us over the years. Whenever he shows up, he generally doesn't put up a strong showing. He frequently gets the crap beaten out of him. He often feels quite weak for his position as primary antagonist of the entire series. And even when he does win, like his fight against Trafalgar Law, he does so quite haphazardly and very damagesomely. However, he's definitely a lot more capable than we've ever seen him depicted on page, with most of his great achievements happening off-screen in the shadows, operating within the narrative darkness that is steadily creeping up on us. At the moment, I just don't know if Blackbeard could carry that same level of respect that Rox did. And from everything we've seen so far, which, to be fair, isn't much, again, Blackbeard's personality doesn't seem at all like Zebek's. Which is odd because Blackbeard is set up to be the man who inherited Zebek's will in the same way that Luffy did with Roger, but Roger and Luffy have extremely similar personalities. I'm just not sure if Blackbeard's the man that Loki would look at and go, yeah, that's my captain. Even though his Devil Fruit abilities are admittedly very geared towards Loki's goal of destroying the world. Zebek literally said shut it to Whitebeard. I can't imagine a single character doing that. I can. His name is Monkey D. Luffy, and he told Whitebeard to shut up during the Paramount War. The only difference is that, assumedly, Rox had the physical substance to back up his verbal smackdown. But also, look at how Whitebeard responds to Luffy in this moment. He smiles and calls him a cheeky devil. So in addition to Roger, it's pretty likely that Luffy reminded Whitebeard of Rox in this moment, being told to shut up, and it really encapsulated the full Will of D experience. About Nash, I'm not sure if it's from Mother Carmel because Nash mentioned knowing Zeus. So I did actually miss something pretty big in this chapter, and I definitely jumped to conclusions about how Nash was created. My immediate assumption was that he'd been made as part of the Winter Solstice incident, because that's the only time we currently know of that the Giants have had to fight against Big Mom. And we do know that she faced off against a lot of them. It wasn't just Yorl. In fact, by the time he got there, the ground was littered with bodies of defeated giants, very potentially containing Goldberg's father, which was when Carmel used her soul powers, and then I guess the logic is something big ol' shield. It's also been pointed out that Nash has a very sort of old man kind of personality, which would fit with Carmel's elderly soul. But this chapter has also presented us with an alternate opportunity, as Rox and Whitebeard were depicted visiting Elbaph, which would imply that the rest of the Rox pirates did as well, including the biggest of mothers. And if she set foot on the island, then it may have started another conflict that got Goldberg's father involved and led to the creation of Nash somehow. And it would also explain how Nash knows about Zeus, which when I read the chapter for the first time, I thought that was Goldberg speaking, not Nash, but I was wrong. And I guess the idea would be that after the conflict, Nash was able to escape or be abducted like how Nami took Zeus, and Zeus subsequently used his own will to become one of Nami's increasing number of slaves. But also, both could be true. Nash could have been conjured during Big Mom 1, the little terror that was Charlotte Linlin, and then found out about Zeus during conflict conflict number the second. And there was also another meeting, assumedly when Loki proposed to Lola and we almost had a marriage, so there are a lot of opportunities to have fought Big Mom or to have met Zeus some way. Whatever the answer is, I really want this Rox Pirates flashback now, because the bigger question has to be, why was Rox on Elbaph to begin with? What's so special about this island that it warranted a visit from the man who wanted to become king of the world? Especially since his dialogue makes it sound like he went out of his way to get there. I don't think this will happen, but how amazing would it be if Elbaph was where Oda chose to drop that bombshell? That it becomes a stealth arc about the Rox Pirates, setting us up to gun straight for Laugh Tale afterwards. The one thing I noticed is that Loki said something like, Roger, I've been born in the wrong era. Roger did indeed say something very similar to that. After landing at Laugh Tale and discovering the One Piece, Roger said that he wished he'd been born in Joy Boy's era. And there's a lot of speculation as to why. The most recent idea being that Roger wanted to explore the full extent of the planet before the majority of it was submerged and inaccessible to adventure. And so Roger, like Loki, is a man who feels a bit out of time. The difference being that Roger took it all in good humor. It's unfortunate that he was born too late to explore the old world and too early to explore the new world. But what can you do? Roger had a great sense of humor when it came to the cruelty of fate and time, whereas Loki seems to have taken his situation a lot harder. He is very, very displeased. We haven't seen even a sliver of the Heaven Realm. This arc might be a lot longer than we think, despite Oda probably not planning it. Not only have we not seen the Heaven World or the Astral World, depending on your translation, but no one's even really mentioned it, not beyond the fact that it exists anyway. We don't know what's up there or why it's up there. There's one whole third of Elbaph left that we haven't even touched yet, which would traditionally indicate that this arc has a while to go yet. At this point, I'm convinced Oda forgot Nami controls weather and not just lightning. So I think this is in reference to Jinbei putting out the fire. He's currently in the same place as Nami, serving Captain Colin as one of the Colin pirates. If Jinbei wasn't there, I suspect that Nami could have conjured some rain, but it wouldn't have been as immediately effective, and we'd probably be dealing with a lot of very well done children right about now. I do agree with the general sentiment though. Nami's abilities do tend to get a bit dumbed down to just big lightning, and even more so now that we've had a big lightning upgrade with Zeus. But in theory, she can conjure any weather phenomena. Rain, wind, heat, water, and combining everything together to create full-on mirages. But we almost always default to lightning, and we have ever since the Climate Act was first introduced, which I don't think quite does Nami's mastery of weather justice, but it is what it is. Loki not possibly reuniting with Rox has me worried about Luffy's chances with Shanks. Maybe your inspiration is supposed to just stay an inspiration. That does appear to be how it goes. Loki was inspired by Rox, and he never meets Rox again. Pedro was inspired by Roger, and he never meets Roger again. And with Luffy being inspired by Shanks, there is a strong chance that Shanks will die before Luffy gets to reunite with him and return the Straw Hat. Now, whenever I mention anything about this, a lot of people say how dissatisfying that would be because it would be breaking their promise, but it's also the only way to ensure that the Straw Hat keeps traveling onwards to the next generation. I don't know if Luffy will return it to Shanks so much as pass it on to a child of the next generation. But that can only happen if Shanks isn't around to take back the hat and eventually fulfill that promise. I keep picturing Loki's voice actor as Garo for One Punch Man for some reason. Look, he could be in the running. This man's name is Hikaru Midorikawa, and he is a pretty damn prolific voice actor, having worked consistently since 1988, which is why it may be surprising to hear that he only has a single One Piece credit, which was voicing Hongo of the Red Hair Pirates in One Piece film Red. And this is wild because One Piece has so many characters that almost every actor in the industry has played multiple characters in the series over the course of the last almost 30 years. But this guy, he's barely touched One Piece, and the one time he did was extremely recently, and so he's probably one of those legendary actors who's being reserved for the right role. I'm convinced Oda changed the time slot just for Kuma backstory. So this is referring to the new anime time slot in Japan, which is 11:15 p.m. It used to be about 9 in the morning. And I will say that Oda almost certainly has nothing to do with this decision. The anime is very much out of his control. However, the time slot change definitely benefits the Kuma backstory, which is going to be covered pretty soon. And it is one of the darkest and most depressing things that Oda has ever put to page. I highly doubt the anime completely changed its business model based on that handful of chapters alone, but it is an example of why One Piece as a whole definitely benefits from a later time slot. Also, the new anime opening is out now. I love it, but it's very bittersweet. It is extremely Bonnie Kuma focused, and it's heartbreaking every time I watch it, but it is really good though. Did Scopper use Voice of All Things and confirm Shamrock has left if he senses 3 concerning voices and not 4? So Gaban flagging these voices is very interesting. He calls them strange, which is not usually how observation haki users refer to detecting people. However, voices is also a pretty vague term that gets used in One Piece. If a character says voice, it doesn't always mean the voice of all things. In fact, it usually doesn't. During one of the many times that Luffy was beaten by the Kaido, Trafalgar Law now infamously said that Luffy's voice had disappeared, but it's more likely that Law was using observation haki as opposed to tapping into this extremely rare and unexplained ability. And the same thing happened with Kobe during the Paramount War. He said that he heard the voices of Marines disappearing around him, but that's also more than likely unlocking high-level observation haki. Maybe not though, perhaps these two characters have also been blessed with voice powers. With Scopper Gaban though, could go either way. If he had the voice of all things, then it would mean that Scopper Gaban could impart his knowledge onto Luffy and teach him how to tap into that power at will, like how Rayleigh taught him haki. But Scopper Gaban is also just the kind of guy whose observation haki would be so high level that he's tapping into a depth of power that nobody else on the island can access. However, hearing 3 voices instead of 4 would indicate that Shamrock has left Elbaph, or that he can otherwise obscure his vocal presence. But the most reasonable thing to assume is that unfortunately Shamrock is gone for now, and that even when it isn't Shanks himself, Oda refuses to give us anything more than a tease of these scarlet-headed legends. That or Scopper Gaban stating the number 3 is a bit of a red herring, making us think that, of course Gaban's referring to the 3 Holy Knights, but there's actually something even stranger and worse going on. That's definitely not the Occam's razor-approved explanation though. The simplest thing here is that the 3 voices are Gunko, Summers, and Killingham. Internet man, can you comment on the rumors that Oda announced One Piece will end in October of 2026? I sure can. So this was a story reported by a One Piece fan account on Twitter. It has no substance, it has no source, and it's not real. And even though this post was made on March 26, what you've got to remember is that every day is April Fool's Day on Twitter, and nothing can be taken at face value, because blue checks are blatantly lying to drum up engagement to generate ad revenue. Scopper's line about the end of the world made me pause. What does he know, and when did he learn it? I mean, he assumedly knows everything that Kozuki Oden did as a result of reaching Laugh Tale, and Oden was able to predict down to the year the beginning of the next great war that's going to engulf the planet. And if Oden could do that, then surely Scopper Gaban's been keeping track of time and knows that this is the promised year. In addition to that, he's probably very well aware of the Harley text and the belief that the world will quite literally end in order to be reborn. So him musing about the end of the world makes perfect sense. Roger's logic. Kid asked to join. Nah mate, no kids. Finds baby in chest. Guess we got a kid now, guys. I mean, yeah, he did reject Child Pedro asking to join, but the Shanks situation was a little bit different. Because Shanks was an accidental baby, someone did not use adequate protection on their treasure chest. Then in went a baby, and look, to Roger's credit, he took responsibility for this accident and raised a fine young man, or at least most of a fine young man. There's a fine young arm missing now, but look, no parenting is perfect. Especially when you look at Roger's other son, Buggy the Clown, who still remains one of the greatest One Piece mysteries. He's the same age as Shanks, and while we don't know for sure if Buggy was taken on board as a baby, he was around 9 years old at the earliest time we've seen him with the crew. And I need to know the story behind how Buggy joined the Roger Pirates. Although this chapter has also fueled some Rock-shaped speculation in that regard. The close-up we see of Rox's eye is quite Buggy-esque, very narrow, quite cynical, scheming and plotting, a very disturbing visual receptacle with a tiny pupil, just like Buggy. And there has been a prominent theory for quite some time that Buggy is the child of Rox, another member of the Will of D, and that's why fate always seems to smile down upon him in such strange yet undeniably successful ways. And if you want to know more about exactly how in-depth that theory goes, then I have a whole video here just waiting to tell you. The final war has already begun, at least according to Gunko, and at least according to the parts of her that were left after being eviscerated by a powersome long nose, before displaying unnatural abilities that we have certainly seen before, and now I am more worried about Gunko than ever, as well as the rest of the Holy Knights. These guys, they're not good. But this chapter actually started on a very hopeful note, as this was a very exciting installment in the Yamato cover story, because for the first time, Yamato seems to be truly inhabiting the life of Kozuki Oden by what appears to be recruiting vassals in the form of Ulti and probably Page 1, which is very Oden-esque because most of his vassals were criminals and other various ne'er-do-wells that were seen as a blight on Wano. As was Oden himself, he was disowned by his father. And do you remember what Oden said when he learned about his father's decision? Oden said that his father was unable to contain Oden's greatness, in much the same way that Kaido was attempting to contain Yamato. And I don't know how much time we have left in this cover story, but I'm wondering if Ulti and Page 1 are just the first, and if there's a possibility that Yamato may be able to recruit all of the remaining Toby Roper members, minus Diaz Drake because he's already found a way off Wano. But I wouldn't rule out who's who joining as a vassal as well. At the very least, he might be tagging along for a bit because we need Yamato to contain him, although I believe we're currently in Udon, so there should be a very convenient prison nearby. But this is the 31st installment in the Yamato cover story, so we are very potentially coming to the end of it quite soon. Most cover stories last into the early to mid-30s, with a couple of them extending into the 40s. But the main plot of this story was all the kidnapped people, and now that we've solved that, I could see this wrapping up pretty quickly. All Yamato needs to do is take Yasuo's sword to Hakumai, and we should be all good here. All good to turn our attention to Elbaph, and Usopp has a pretty spectacular moment in this chapter where he delivers the most devastating attack of his lifetime, blowing Gunko to pieces with a nice skull bomb, an attack that I think I've recently said should be more devastating than it ever ends up being. But unfortunately for Usopp, these attacks are only allowed to succeed when they do no damage, and therefore I guess do not succeed. But I love how shocked everyone was, including Usopp himself, because it was an almost Tarantino-esque sudden moment of ultra-violence. You know, when all of a sudden just bang, an integral character is unceremoniously killed. But then Gunko starts regenerating, and there is no doubt in my mind that this is the exact same regeneration ability we've seen before with the 5 Elder Stars, which may not be immediately apparent in some examples because Saint Saturn's regeneration is portrayed a bit differently. However, if you look at when Atlas blew herself up to briefly stop Ethan Baron Venustura, he regenerated in the same way that Gunko is here with the exact same sound effect. In the official English, this was translated as crick crick, but in Japanese, it's paki paki, which is the onomatopoeia for the sound of breaking, cracking, or snapping. And it's the exact same onomatopoeia that accompanies Gunko's regeneration in this chapter. So far, I have to say, I've been pretty dismissive of the idea that Gunko could be physically connected to Imu, or even part of Imu, until now that is. Before, people were only making the connection of Gunko to Imu because of the arrow. But with the regeneration and the ability to conjure the Abyss Circles, it's like Gunko is Imu's equivalent of one of Vegapunk's satellites. However, that could just be because Gunko is the only Holy Knight we've seen conjure the Abyss Circle and regenerate, and it is possible that each of the Holy Knights have been gifted and or cursed with this power, which would make them a huge pain in the man parts to deal with, and in which case Elbaph is the arc where we need to discover the weakness to this ability, because there's no running away this time. We've got to deal with these guys right here, right now. When Colin accuses Gunko of the worst possible crime, the crime of being human, Gunko very quickly sets the record straight by saying, "Mate, we are gods," which I guess is not unexpected from a Holy Knight, but it is unexpected from someone who isn't a celestial dragon. And the crew go on to say that Gunko sounds like Enel, which is fun. It's always nice to have an Enel mention in the series, which I don't think we've had since Luffy remembered seeing Observation Haki when Rayleigh was training him in the final pre-time skip chapter. But they also say that Gunko sounds like a world noble, and I wonder if this might be a bit of a misdirect, because the world nobles do refer to themselves at every available opportunity and as obnoxiously as possible as gods, but we do know through the repeatedly satisfying beatings of St. Charlos that they do not have the abilities of Gunko, the 5 elders, and perhaps even the rest of the Holy Knights. So when Gunko uses this god terminology, she may be referring to a very different existence and something much closer to a literal god than the delusions of the average world noble. Gunko got so mad when Colin called her a human, and there's a very curious close-up after this. Gunko pulls a very Jotaro maneuver by grabbing the tip of her hat, and for some reason we then cut to a close-up of Brook. And initially I thought this might be because he was the only character left who hadn't had a close-up on that page yet, but Eiichiro Oda is a very careful man, and he doesn't tend to create a lot of throwaway panels. There is a reason why he saved Brook for this moment. And the reason why is because later it is Brook, of all people, who is able to identify Gunko as a holy knight. Not necessarily Gunko herself, but Brook knew exactly what she was, and this is beyond fascinating to me. As far as I'm aware, nobody except for Loki knew that holy knights were on this island, and it's also hard to tell how many people know about holy knights in general, because even Jinbei in this chapter doesn't pick up on Gunko's status in the same way that Brook does, and Jinbei is usually our reliable reservoir of global knowledge. I imagine that Robin probably knows about them because Dragon does, and she spent 2 years with the Dragon, and I don't know if I'm reading into this too much. I probably am, I always do. But I do think that Oda's giving us a bit of insight into Brook here. If he knows about the Holy Knights, it means that he either heard about them while he was alive, which is a very long time ago, or more interestingly, he even met the Holy Knights during his living career as a pirate, or more likely even before that, during his secret pre-pirate history, where he was the leader of a certain kingdom's battle convoy. Brook has a history of being a pretty high-up military official for a currently unknown kingdom, and I can see a diplomatic situation where Holy Knights of the time were present on his island, and Brook may have seen firsthand exactly the kind of power that they're capable of. I'm fully willing to accept that this is just me dreaming, but One Piece is all about dreams, and right now I'm really feeling like Oda is going out of his way to link Brook and Gunko, because he's the one who seems to have this knowledge and maybe even personal history with the Holy Knights, and she's the one who is listening to his music right before attacking the Colin Pirates. I should say that Gunko does not recognize Brook in this chapter, despite being a huge fan of his music, or at least that one song, but I do think that there's some business being set up here, and it may depend more on a situation where Brook actually needs to play music, maybe as some sort of plan to wake the kids up. And just to cap off the Brook discussion, he also had my favorite line of the chapter, which was while Gunko was regenerating, Brook was musing about how unnerving it was to watch the dead rise, which is my favorite kind of Brook joke. The skull jokes are very easy and quite predictable, but I love whenever Brook is freaked out by the supernatural, despite the fact that he is a living skeleton soul king. In general, I have to say that Gunko seriously elevated herself in this chapter, because she took on 4 straw hats and dismissed them all pretty comfortably, which isn't so much a surprise for Nami, Usopp, and even Brook, but the really shocking thing is just how easily she handled Jinbei, because that guy is a step up from everyone else in this group. There is a reason why his bounty is over 1 billion berries, although I guess technically Brook is the one who deals with Jinbei because Gunko manipulates their attacks to hit one another. And I think that finesse is a good word. Gunko uses her abilities very thoughtfully, very gratefully, with wonderful finesse. She's like a surgeon making very precise incisions. And she's quite a terrifying opponent because it appears that when you're fighting Gunko, you're not just fighting her, you are also fighting yourself. Stop hitting yourself. And she's one opponent where ganging up on her actually gives Gunko an advantage, because she now has more firepower to take from your allies and turn back onto you. I do also think it was pretty important for Gunko to dismiss, what was it, 40% of the crew here? Not so much as a display of raw power, I mean, that's part of it. The Holy Knights are, in the grand scheme of things, a hierarchical step down from facing the 5 elders on Egghead, so they can't help but feel a bit underwhelming in comparison, and so there is that desire to see them fight battle real good. But with Gunko, it's more about thematic importance, because Gunko has a very revealing monologue that we will get into, but there Gunko makes it clear that she has completely submitted herself to fate. Gunko doesn't even know if any of her actions, any of the things she's doing right now are going to have any meaning in the long run. Everything she's doing could be completely pointless. And this is very much reflected in her devil fruit ability. Gunko creates arrows of unstoppable fate. Everything you do against them may be completely pointless. And even when you know what's going to happen, you can't do anything about it, which is the situation we're in right now. We know that the world is going to be plunged into a colossal war for better or worse, which has previously been told to us by Kozuki Oden, planned for by the Roger Pirates, and now even dictated to us by the ancient Harley text on Elbaph. And sometimes it can definitely feel like, even when things are going real well, that One Piece is very much on rails. If Luffy strays too far from the rails, then fate intervenes to put him back on again. But in order to defeat a Gunko, you're gonna need to figure out how to overcome this. And so dealing with her could be our thematic first step towards changing the fate of the planet as we know it. Because as much as we believe that we're heading to the dawn of the world, whether that's a better or worse option than what we have right now has been left quite purposely vague. Currently, fate could have locked in a pretty terrible outcome that we're gonna have to find a way to fight back against. And a key element in doing so, at least according to Gunko, is which side has the allegiance of the giants. And now, with that, all of a sudden Elbaph is making so much more sense. Not just Elbaph either, but everything we've seen of giants in One Piece up to this point. With that goal in mind, you can see why Mother Carmel was an emissary on Elbaph to traffic giant children to enlist in the Marines, because they know that the giants are going to be integral, and so the world government was doing everything they could to build an army of their own giants. And that's also why they went to some great lengths to recruit Oimo and Kashi to protect Enisobi. In theory, it's a lot easier to just kill them for their pirating crimes rather than going to the trouble of turning them into allies. But giants are treated very differently by the world government because this war prophecy demands their presence. And it also makes me wonder how much, if anything, the Big Mom may have known about this, given her desperation to have giants incorporated within her family and make an alliance with Elbaph. And this could also extend to Kaido as well, with one of his goals being to create a nation of Oni, which as we all know now are ancient giants. All of which leads us back to Mr. King Harold. Saint Summers curses King Harold at the end of this chapter, indicating that Harold did have a deal with the world government at some point in time, and he could have been the one working with Mother Carmel to sell off the giant orphans. And Summers is very, very miffed that Harold seems to have messed all of this up, and by messing up, that could mean a couple of things. The first may be that Harold had a change of heart and led Elbaph's cultural revolution of peace, which is what he's currently known and remembered for, or that Harold continued his agreement with the world government until Loki found out, at which point Harold suffered death by murder, and Loki himself may be directly responsible for saving the world by changing the future of the giants. And if you look at it that way, Big Mom may also be somewhat responsible for saving the world by accidentally eating Mother Carmel and stopping the steady flow of orphans. And just on Summers, he's currently in battle combat with former Vice Admiral Jaguar D. Saul, and I have to say, I don't like seeing Saul in this condition. He's barely standing, he's bleeding everywhere, and doing whatever he can to make sure that Robin and Chopper stay hidden in his beard, and it's feeling a lot like his last stand on Ohara. Not that I think Saul's going to die, I just don't like seeing it. To me, having Saul die here would defeat the purpose of having him be alive in the first place, because the only worse thing than narratively reviving your characters is then to immediately kill them after you've gone to all that effort. And while I do feel for Robin, there's a panel of her in quite a bit of distress because of what's happening to precious Saul. At the same time though, Robin and Chopper are not weak and helpless, and I'm not sure why they're just hiding in Saul's beard instead of leaping into action to help him as well as all the children. The way Oda draws them is as if Robin and Chopper are both helpless civilians, or as if they're both kids having their flashback play out in real time with their mentor dying while saving them. And that's a bit disappointing after seeing how much effort and spirit they both had during Wano. Robin became a demon and Chopper was taking on Queen at one point, and I get that there's probably going to be a story purpose for them to need to be hidden and not flagged by Summers at this stage, but it is a bit disappointing to see two mighty Straw Hats depicted as entirely helpless here in the same chapter where Usopp and Nami were doing everything they could against Gunko. Maybe it's all part of a clever ruse. Saul is pretending to be defeated to lower the guard of Mr. St. Summers, and then Robin and Chopper, they're going to leap out of the beard, do a big surprise attack, and then something good things will happen. So maybe that'll happen, and if so, I guess I'll change my opinion, but this week, I have to say, I'm a bit disappointed in both of them. Especially Robin, because she spent all of the major Egghead stuff injured and unconscious, so I hope that Elbaph doesn't keep her in that damsel role for the arc once again. But despite that, another big winner of this chapter was Ohara in general, as Gunko stated that some humans found out about this future war, and among them was Olvia and Professor Clover. I loved seeing Clover in particular, and it struck me that we've been seeing an awful lot of him lately in the grand scheme of things, as with this panel, Clover has officially made appearances during Wano, Egghead Island, and Elbaph. He's someone that Oda has been keenly keeping on the old mind brain, and I do think that we'll be seeing more of him in the future as well. Maybe not during Elbaph, but after this, what's left? We're getting into very serious stuff. Void Sentries, Laugh Tales, Will of D's, and so you'd better believe that Cloud D. Clover will be featured in some capacity. But given the newfound importance of the giants, this has me thinking about how Elbaph is going to end, because the standard answer would be to repel the Holy Knights, forge a proper alliance with the Giants, and go into the final war with that certainty that yes, we, good guys, are going to win. Which almost sounds anticlimactic. If we've got all the Giants on our side and they're the major key of this conflict, then where's the tension? So this is unlikely, but I wonder if there's a possible ending where the Giants don't pledge their allegiance to Luffy and instead look elsewhere. We do have the seeds for that potential baked in already, with many of the Giants fearing Nika as a destroyer. And while I can't ever see Dory, Broggy, Saul, and our other key Giants turning against us, it may be a pretty natural move for the rest of the island to fear what Luffy is, because his presence has coincided with this Nightmare Apocalypse beginning, and soon it's going to be known that he was the one who freed Loki, so there's quite a bit that could swing public opinion against Luffy and reverse the classic arc formula where we arrive on an island of enemies and make friends, and have us instead land on an island of friends and make enemies, all of which setting us up for one hell of an uphill struggle during this final war. How crazy would it be if Brook had been to Marjois before by accompanying the king of that certain kingdom during a reverie? Yes, now that is a nice idea. In the previous video, I proposed that the Holy Knights may have come to visit this certain kingdom, but this is much more better. From what we know, Brook was essentially the head of this kingdom's entire military, and so he could have accompanied the royalty of that island to the reverie as a representative, or at least as a guard to the royalty, because other representatives and various escorts are allowed to be there as well. They're just not allowed to be present in the room whilst all the kings and queens are having their chit-chats. And we saw some pretty horrific stuff happening during the most recent reverie, with Charlos attempting to enslave Shirahoshi, so Brook could have encountered a similar situation, something that didn't quite end as well for the victim, and that might be what caused him to resign his position and take up the more simplistic life of piracy. And it is possible because in Brook's flashback, the Rumbar pirates did seem to have knowledge of the Grand Line before they entered, at least a lot more knowledge than the Straw Hats did, which Brook would have had if he'd traveled there as part of a reverie entourage. But then there's the more disturbing possibility, which is that Brook's shift to piracy was a bit more enforced. Perhaps if, say, this nation was subject to a native hunting contest, which prior to God Valley, the world government used to hold quite regularly, choosing an unaffiliated nation as their non-consensual host, and that definitely would have given Brook the opportunity to encounter Holy Knights as they are the great heroes of the competition, slaying rabbit after rabbit to bring honor to their various family names. And I doubt this is what happened, but maybe Brook's Devil Fruit was even one of the prizes for this contest, like Kaido's and Kuma's was a prize for the God Valley one. I do imagine the ability to live a second life would be pretty coveted amongst the world nobles, and it would only delude them further into believing that they are gods. So maybe, just maybe, Elbaph does end up being a bit of a stealth Brook arc. I'm not sure it will, but that would make me unreasonably happy. It looks like Ripley used Frankie as a handgun. Yes, I think this is exactly what's happening. In the wide shot of Ripley running away, it looks like she's pointing Frankie at the scary thundercloud, and he's clearly just fired a shot, so yes, Ripley did use him like a gun. Although one thing that is very unusual on this page for Frankie in general is that there's a running gag in One Piece where boys are impressed by Frankie and girls are painfully underwhelmed or even bored by him. Whenever he whips out a new invention or technique, all the guys get stars in their eyes, while Nami and Robin just sigh and pretend to ignore what the cyborg in Speedos is doing. But on this page, Frankie impresses Ripley, Lilith, and Bonnie. Lilith and Bonnie are even cheering for him with a little heart in the Japanese text. So Frankie is finally getting a bit of the appreciation he deserves from the other 50% of the planet, and I would love to see a continued Ripley-Frankie team-up where she pew-pews him at assorted enemies. The Nami Brook switch-out being electrocuted was genuinely one of the most laugh-out-loud moments I've read in One Piece. That was a very underrated piece of teamwork, but Brook and Nami have been working on this for a while. The shell of this idea was something Brook came up with on Thriller Bark, to use his body to become a piercing arrow of lightning. But Nami and Brook have also practiced this switch-out technique, and they actually used it against Big Mom and Zeus during Whole Cake Island. And I don't think this has ever been confirmed, but my personal headcanon for how this works is that Nami uses Mirage Tempo to make Brook look like her, and possibly even to make her look like Brook. I saw a decent theory that traveling with the Abyss doesn't actually travel, but rather creates a body at the end point that the user's consciousness inhabits. I think that that is a very interesting idea, because there's certainly a difference between traveling via the Abyss and actually physically going somewhere, which we saw when the 5 elders were on Egghead Island. Everyone except for Saint Saturn had their spawn points de-triggered, and they ended up back in the Room of Authority. However, Saturn didn't have that option and or restriction available to him because he physically sailed to Egghead. However, Oda did make a point of cutting to the Room of Authority during Egghead, and he showed it to be completely empty, implying that the elders were physically on Egghead. And there's also that fun gag of St. Summers being transported with his couch. But perhaps traveling by the abyss is a mixture of both. Your body is absorbed by the abyss, and it creates a special body at the desired destination with all of these regenerative abilities. But then again, St. Saturn was also able to regenerate even after he physically moved to Egghead, but then again, he did also use the abyss to teleport from his ship to Egghead itself. After thinking about it for a while, these regenerative powers of late are really reminiscent to pre-time skip Logia users. The dread and untouchability is all there. Yeah, it is a bit like that. Although after having dealt with Logia users, I'm a bit more comfortable with this, because I know that there is going to be some trick or condition to getting around it. Someone in my comments also pointed out how similar these regeneration abilities are to the homunculi regeneration in Full Metal Alchemist, so maybe there's some kind of core within them that we need to attack, like whatever the mark of the abyss is that allows them to use it, or even disrupting the integrity of the circles used to summon them. Saul specifically says that Robin and Chopper should stay hidden in order to save the children. That is the reason they do not show themselves, because if they did, they would have to face Summers and nobody would be left alive to save the kids at the moment. I am really baffled that so many people just do not understand this whole scene. So this is in response to me complaining about Robin and Chopper just hiding in the last chapter. And this is my fault, I should have been more clear about what I meant. I understand the reasoning that Oda is trying to give us, I just don't buy it. At the moment, the reasoning is that Robin and Chopper have to stay hidden so that they can save the children. However, this trio formed with the purpose of finding out whose power was binding the children. And Robin even said that searching for whoever that is their quote only option. And they found him. It's St. Summers. He's right here and the powers clearly belong to him because he's currently summoning a bunch of thorns. So this is kind of it. You can't save the children without freeing them from Summers' powers. You can't even touch them unless Summers releases them. And every moment they spend not beating that old man puts these children at even greater risk as they are marched to their doom. So in the context of this and this chapter alone, which is what these videos are based on, individual chapters, this just accomplishes very little from my perspective. Soul gets beaten and we still have no way of saving the children because Summers is still upright. And maybe here the implication is that Soul doesn't believe that they can beat Summers with just the three of them, and there's no one else free at the moment to keep the kids safe. But again, beating Summers is kind of non-optional here. Sure, you can keep Robin and Chopper there, but they can't touch the kids. But now I should say that I do think this will pay off and make more sense in the future. For example, Soul's fallen down and we know that he really enjoys playing dead, so I can definitely see him doing his trademark rawr in the next chapter or the one after that. So my hope is that the plan is for Soul to surprise Summers, to do something that temporarily releases his abilities, and for Robin and Chopper to use that opportunity to save the kids. But just going by what I'm seeing in this chapter alone, it's a bit disappointing to watch Robin and Chopper being so meek when I know that they are capable of so much more. It's also interesting that this hiding in the beard strategy is even working in the first place. You know what? I guess this isn't confirmed, but you would think that the Holy Knights have pretty good observation haki, so Summers really should be able to sense Robin and Chopper. But this may also go back to what Scopa-Gaban was saying about sensing a trio of quote abnormal voices, which also applies to Shamrock. When Scopa-Gaban met Luffy, he mentioned an abnormal haki coming from Oris Castle, all of which could tie into the discussion we just had about the Abyss. If these aren't even the real bodies of the Holy Knights, then that would definitely explain their abnormality. I also don't think we've seen any Holy Knight actually use haki beyond the Spell Circle Lightning effect, and even then they're not really using it. It is being used on them. So maybe they can't use haki and they're relying on a completely different and abnormal power system. Or maybe Summers is just being far too arrogant and not even tapping into observation to sense Robin and Chopper. But either way, I'm ready for whatever's happening here to actually happen. The Gunko is secretly good and Harold was secretly evil theories both took a pretty solid blow this week, The Gunko one did, but I think that the Harold idea got even stronger. Given that Summers seems to have all but confirmed that Harold was working with the world government at some point, or at the very least King Harold was being duped by the world government and he had an arrangement with them that he thought would be beneficial to Elbaph, like when Odin made a deal with the Orochi for some Nike dancing that Odin never got paid for. But then if Harold was good, we have to ask why did Loki kill him unless Loki is actually a very bad man. But if Loki's a very bad man, then we need to ask why does Luffy trust him so naturally and easily silly. Questions. So many questions. Most of which are answered a lot more straightforwardly if we go with the idea that Harold probably wasn't a good guy. And I definitely haven't given up on Gunko. I have talked about it, but I don't personally buy into the idea that she's some sort of secret Revolutionary Army spy. However, I am going to need to see a lot more to convince me that she is irredeemable. At the moment, to me, especially with this chapter, it feels like she's resigned herself to a fate that she believes is inevitable. Not at all the same, but maybe kind of like when Robin believed that the only thing that she could do was die. In this chapter, Gunko says, once it starts, it cannot be undone. No one can stop it. And as I keep pointing out, she doesn't gloat or seem happy about it like the world nobles. It's very much just a statement of fact. And I'm really eager to see Gunko get her first taste of changing fate, because you can't have an ideology this inflexible and not be challenged to your core by seeing Luffy defy what Gunko believes to be fate. Because if there's anything my extensive history of watching cartoons has taught me, then at the very least Luffy should have the power to redirect Gunko's arrows just because he wants to do something fun and nothing is off limits to his abilities. In fact, technically in this very chapter, Gunko's fate was briefly overcome when she deflected Nami's amazing Shark Thunder attack. That looks so cool. But she did that and Gunko dictated via her arrow fate that it would hit Nami. That's where the arrows pointed, that's where the fate was locked in, but fate got unlocked because that turned out to be Brook. So we're already seeing these little signs of fate not being quite as set in stone as Gunko thinks. Gunko cannot direct inanimate objects. This is why Usopp's attack landed. That could be true, but it could also be because she just didn't care, or was doing it to make a point. This could be a pretty big despair flex, Gunko purposely showing off the regeneration abilities in order to prove her superiority, because this did come right after she was accused of being a filthy human, so Gunko may have wanted to show off and set the record straight on this issue of humanity. I like that the Holy Knights are quite competent and good fighters, and this chapter has built the tension that Elbaph was lacking. I definitely love everything we continue to see from the Holy Knights. Every chapter does leave me more and more in awe of them, which is the intended effect because I am a mere human. But I have to say, story-wise, I'm still not sure if I'm really feeling that tension yet. And it's because of the fantastic panel in this chapter where Luffy and Loki are just stuffing themselves, chilling together in the underworld, having a great old time, and I think it's pretty difficult to feel tension in One Piece when Luffy doesn't feel under pressure. And we've also got Zoro and Sanji down there as well, just ball-sacking about. So let's put this into some sort of sport analogy. On Elbaph, we've just had kickoff, and for whatever reason, we've decided to start the match with a team full of reserves. Our actual starting lineup, Captain Luffy, the Zoras, the Sanjis, right now they're on the bench having a great time messing around with some guy that we've just met. And I'm just waiting for the game to get serious enough for Coach Oda to sub Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji in. Because it's going to be very hard to convince me that something's a threat without the monster trio feeling pressure in the game. I find it interesting that, looking back, Killingham almost seems to downplay everything he manifests from dreams as just dreams. It's like he sees no inherent worth in dreams at all, at least if he cannot gain something immediately from it. So I really like that reading on St. Killingham. When we, or at least I, was introduced to his devil fruit, I was mind blown, because I know that we men on the internet say this a lot, but this genuinely has to be one of the most ridiculously powerful devil fruits in the entire series, which is why it would be amazing if Killingham and the other Holy Knights see almost no value in it, because they don't care about dreams. They don't need to dream. They have everything their twisted hearts could desire at Marijois, which is why this fruit may get used as a utility item to make salt and stuff and given to the goofy St. Killingham, and also why Killingham himself is unable to see the value and wonder of what he's creating. And that would open Elbaph up to the literal power of dreams being put on display to defy the expectations of the Holy Knights. Chopper has the ability to determine people's weaknesses, like on Drum Island and Alabasta. What if this ability helps them in defeating the Holy Knights thus hidden away? I really miss Chopper using that ability. Scope, so fun. As cool as snapping in and out of Monster Point is, I do miss when Chopper had to use his skills to pay the combat bills. But Chopper hasn't used Scope post-time skip at all, I think, and so I wouldn't count on him using it now. I honestly wouldn't even count on him being relevant at all to discovering a weakness for the Holy Knights. He might find a way to wake the kids up eventually, but at the moment he's too busy hiding in the beards of strange men it is he's just met. I know this isn't super relevant, but do you think Shanks purposely lied to Luffy about the name of his fruit and knew from his time in the Holy Land. I always thought it was weird how instantly he says the name to him, and Luffy being the only devil fruit user who actually has to come up with names for his attacks. So Luffy's definitely not the only fruit user who has to come up with names for his attacks, lest we forget Kaku and his pasta machine. But when it comes to this, I'm personally in the camp that Oda originally did not intend for Luffy to have a different devil fruit. In 1997, when Chapter 1 was first published, Luffy was supposed to have the Gomu Gomu. But Oda then refined this idea over the decades and eventually retconned it. And while I'm personally on board with that meta explanation, it does still require an in-world explanation as to whether or not Shanks knew what this fruit was actually called, and whether he was the one who even improvised a name for the fruit. There's a bunch of theories that Shanks made up the name after seeing Luffy's arm stretch, and so he decided to very loudly make up the name and ability of the fruit in order to prevent any unwanted ears from discovering the truth. There's also one particularly crazy conspiracy theory involving Higema the bear. During his altercation with Shanks, Higema claims to have killed 56 people, which is Luffy's trademark number and can be pronounced as Gomu. So this idea claims that Gomu was one of the most recent things that Shanks heard, and so it was the first thing that came to his mind to lie about in regards to the fruit, and in a weird way, Higema the bear actually named Luffy's devil fruit. Although when Who's Who is having his fight chat with Jinbei, he does mention Luffy's fruit by name, perhaps implying that it was given the fake name prior to Shanks taking it. And if so, then I imagine that it was named by the Five Elders to keep the Nika name from reaching anyone's ears. But I don't know if that's right either. If that were the case, then the Elders would know that Luffy has the Nika powers because he keeps very loudly screaming his attacks in the fake name that they gave the devil fruit. And so they should have taken him a lot more seriously, a lot more sooner. But also, Who's Who may have not been told the name of the fruit that he was escorting, and just assumed the name after Luffy became a pirate and word of his ability spread. Man on the internet, could this arc convince the Giants to restart being a war tribe again? So I know it's not going to turn out this way, but at the moment, the moral of the Elbaph story does seem very pro-war. We tried this peace business and it was lovely, but it left our society defenseless. It's a very interesting take on war, actually, because the Giants are fated to be a major part of the final war. However, it's only because their society abandoned war and adopted peace that they aren't being used by the world government for that final war. However, they do still need to fight in that final war on the side of the Sun God, and to do that, society needs to embrace at least part of their former culture, whilst not losing the progress they've made in the past half a century or so. And I really am looking forward to seeing how Warland decides to progress. It might end up being a more simplistic do what's right because it's right shonen outcome, but I have to admit that Oda making Elbaph a nation of peace off screen has made Elbaph a lot more interesting than I could have predicted.